The creature known as IT formed not in our universe, but in a dimension outside the regions of space known as the macroverse. This realm, existing beyond human comprehension and scientific measurement, represented a void where the laws governing reality operated differently. Time held no meaning there, emotion remained foreign, and consciousness existed in forms that would shatter human minds, attempting to perceive them directly. The macroverse served as birthplace for entities that preceded creation itself, beings whose existence predated galaxies, stars, and planets. It belonged to a classification of entities called glamours, shape-shifting creatures billions of years old. These beings possessed no fixed physical form, instead existing as pure consciousness, capable of manifesting in whatever shape served their purposes. The glamours fed not on matter or energy in conventional sense, but on emotions, particularly fear. This made them psychic parasites, dependent on conscious beings to provide sustenance through terror and anguish. It represented one such glamour, though perhaps the most malevolent and powerful encountered by humanity. The true form of IT, the essence beneath all disguises, was known as the deadlights. These manifested as clusters of glowing orange lights, pulsing with ancient power and incomprehensible malice. To gaze directly upon the deadlights meant madness, the human mind unable to process what it witnessed. Those unfortunate enough to see them entered catatonic states, consciousness trapped between dimensions, while their bodies remained suspended in paralyzed horror. The deadlights represented ET's core being, the source from which all manifestations emerged and to which all returned. Human perception proved insufficient for comprehending IT's true nature. The closest approximation mortal minds could achieve was visualizing IT as an enormous spider, female in configuration, dwelling in darkness beneath the earth. This spider form, while terrifying, remained merely interpretation rather than reality. It existed beyond such categorization, a being for which earthly taxonomy provided no adequate description. The spider represented the human brain's desperate attempt to assign familiar shape to incomprehensible cosmic horror. Within the macroverse, IT possessed a counterpart, an entity representing opposing forces in eternal cosmic balance. This being, known as Maturin, took the form of an ancient turtle of unimaginable size. Where IT embodied chaos, malevolence, and destruction, Maturin represented order, benevolence, and creation. According to cosmic law, Maturin had created the known universe through a profound act of upset stomach, the resulting expulsion forming galaxies, stars, and eventually life itself. This creation happened accidentally, Maturin simply existing and the universe emerging as consequence. The relationship between IT and Maturin exemplified dualism found throughout existence. Light required darkness, creation needed destruction, good defined itself against evil. These opposing forces maintained balance across dimensions, neither able to fully dominate while both remained. Maturin, despite possessing power to challenge ET, followed principles of non-interference. The turtle believed beings must help themselves, offering guidance but refusing direct intervention. This philosophy would prove crucial when humans eventually confronted the ancient evil. Maturin's existence provided hope in face of IT's malevolence. The turtle, kind and wise, occasionally nudged individuals toward necessary realizations. Those who encountered Maturin in psychic journeys received advice emphasizing self-reliance and belief. The turtle understood that true victory required internal strength rather than external rescue. This wisdom, cryptic and frustrating to desperate souls, contained profound truth about confronting evil. Power existed within those threatened, waiting only for courage to access it. The cosmic balance between IT and Maturin extended beyond simple opposition. Both existed as fragments of something larger, aspects of forces that predated even the macroverse. Some scholars of the esoteric suggested a higher power called Gan, or simply the Other, from which both entities emerged. This supreme being allegedly created or allowed creation of all things, remaining distant while derivative powers played out eternal conflicts. Whether true or merely speculation, the concept suggested IT represented piece of larger cosmic machinery rather than isolated aberration. Its existence in the macroverse stretched back billions of years. The entity experienced time differently than humans, or perhaps experienced no time at all. Eons passed as moments, moments stretched into eternities. This timeless existence meant IT possessed patience beyond mortal comprehension. The creature could wait centuries between feedings, hibernating in perfect stillness, awakening only when hunger demanded. This patience made IT particularly dangerous, outlasting civilizations, species, and geological epochs. The macroverse itself remained largely mysterious even to those who glimpsed it. Descriptions from rare survivors who touched its boundaries spoke of endless void, swirling darkness punctuated by distant lights. Some perceived it as space between spaces, dimension overlaying all others. Others experienced it as psychic realm where consciousness travelled unbound by physical limitations. The truth likely encompassed all interpretations and none, the macroverse existing beyond categorical understanding. One crucial day, measured in human terms though meaningless to IT, the entity departed the macroverse. Whether driven by hunger, curiosity, or cosmic imperative remained unknown. It travelled across dimensional barriers, seeking worlds with conscious life to provide sustenance. The journey took IT through spaces between spaces, darkness beyond darkness, until the entity detected suitable destination. Earth, young planet teeming with developing life, offered perfect feeding ground. The arrival occurred millions of years before humans evolved. It crashed into Earth's surface in cataclysmic event resembling asteroid impact. The collision created crater that would eventually define geography of northern Maine. The impact released tremendous energy, reshaping landscape and leaving permanent scar in planetary crust. This wound in the Earth would never fully heal, retaining connection to the entity that created it. The crash landing trapped IT in ways the entity hadn't anticipated. The very fragments of whatever cosmic vessel carried IT to Earth possessed properties that limited the creature's mobility. These star fragments, scattered across impact site, created barriers the entity struggled to cross. Indigenous peoples who later arrived discovered these fragments held power over IT, using them to establish boundaries the creature couldn't breach. The cage that brought IT to Earth became prison, constraining its territorial range. Following the impact, IT entered prolonged dormancy. The journey exhausted even an ancient entity's reserves. The creature burrowed deep beneath the Earth, settling into hibernation that would last until conscious prey evolved. Its presence affected the land above, subtle corruption seeping into soil, water, and air. The location remained hostile to life, flora struggling, fauna sensing wrongness and avoiding the area. This environmental blight would persist for millennia. As ages passed and life evolved, IT began stirring occasionally. The development of consciousness on Earth registered in the creature's awareness. Early hominids, Neanderthals, and eventually Homo sapiens provided faint sustenance even before IT fully awakened. The entity sensed their simple fears, crude terrors of predators, darkness, and death. These primal emotions, while less satisfying than more complex fears, proved it could feed on this world's inhabitants. The creature discovered advantages to Earth's environment despite initial constraints. The planet's abundance of life meant nearly infinite food supply. Conscious beings multiplied across continents, each carrying fears it could exploit. Moreover, these beings possessed remarkable imaginations. capable of conjuring terrors more elaborate than simple survival fears. Human children, particularly, developed rich inner worlds filled with monsters, creating perfect conditions for IT's feeding methodology. Its feeding process required preparation. Simply consuming prey provided minimal sustenance. The entity learned that fear amplified taste, making terrified flesh infinitely more satisfying. This discovery led to IT's signature methodology, stalking victims over extended periods, manifesting as their worst nightmares, building terror to crescendo before final consumption. The phrase, salting the meat, described this process, fear acting as seasoning that transformed mere survival into gourmet experience. The shape-shifting abilities that defined glamours proved perfectly suited to this feeding style. It could read minds, perceiving deepest fears and manifesting precisely as those terrors. For one victim, IT became diseased leper, for another drowned child, for yet another savage werewolf. This adaptability made IT nearly impossible to prepare against. Every confrontation brought personalized nightmare, defenses useless against evil that knew your mind before you acted. Children became preferred prey for multiple reasons beyond taste. Their fears operated at instinctive level, pure and potent. They believed in monsters more completely than adults, their conviction making manifestations more powerful. Furthermore, children possessed less psychological defense, their courage underdeveloped, their understanding of mortality incomplete. This vulnerability made them easy prey, their imagination simultaneously empowering IT and sealing their doom. Its relationship with the land surrounding the impact site grew increasingly symbiotic. The creature's presence corrupted the location, but also sustained it. The ground itself seemed alive with malevolent awareness, stones remembering violence, earth absorbing blood and screams. This corruption would later attract human settlement despite all warnings. People drawn to cursed ground by forces they couldn't articulate. The land wanted inhabitants, and IT wanted food. The hibernation cycles emerged as necessary pattern. Feeding frenzies exhausted IT despite satisfaction gained. The creature required decades to digest both physical and psychic nourishment. 27 to 30 years became standard interval, precise enough to establish pattern, yet variable enough to surprise. This cyclical nature meant IT existed mostly in dormancy, brief periods of terrible wakefulness punctuating long sleeps. Each awakening brought fresh horror. Each hibernation gave communities brief respite. Perhaps most significantly, IT's arrival on Earth established precedent for cosmic horror intersecting mundane existence. The entity proved that ancient evils could infiltrate reality, that monsters existed beyond human mythology. This revelation, unknown to most who encountered IT, suggested universe operated on principles beyond scientific understanding. Magic, psychic power, and cosmic consciousness existed as surely as gravity and electromagnetism. Its presence made such truths undeniable to those who survived encounters. The creature's connection to the macroverse never fully severed. It maintained link to that dimension, using it for various purposes. The deadlights existed partially there, making them harder to destroy. Psychic battles occurred partly in the macroverse, consciousness travelling across dimensions to engage IT on its home territory. This connection meant IT possessed advantages that purely physical creatures lacked, able to attack minds while remaining physically distant. As millions of years passed and human civilization eventually developed, IT waited beneath the land that would become Derry, Maine. The entity sensed the approaching age of abundant consciousness. Humans built settlements, formed communities, developed complex societies with intricate fears. These sophisticated terrors, anxieties about social status, existential dread, psychological trauma, offered feeding possibilities beyond simple survival fears. It anticipated the coming feast. The creature that had travelled across dimensions, crashed into Earth in prehistoric violence, and slept through ages of planetary evolution, prepared for active phase. The time approached when conscious prey would arrive at the impact site, building homes directly above ancient hunger. It possessed patience to wait for perfect moment, intelligence to plan elaborate terror, and power to overwhelm most resistance. The stage was set for centuries of cyclical horror. With IT's arrival, the land that would become Derry gained a permanent resident, an ancient hunger that would shape every moment of the town's future existence. The cosmic entity that crashed from beyond space had found new home, even if that home was also prison. The fragments of its vessel constrained territorial range, but within those boundaries, IT would reign supreme. The sleeping evil beneath the earth waited for humans to arrive, bringing their fears, their children, and their inability to remember warnings from previous generations. Long before European settlement, the land beneath Derry belonged to the Shokopewa tribe, who discovered the sleeping evil and learned to live in careful balance with its presence. These people arrived in the region thousands of years after IT's crash landing, finding territory rich in game, water, and resources, despite persistent wrongness permeating certain areas. The Shokopewa developed a sophisticated understanding of the natural world, reading signs in forest and stream, recognizing when land welcomed habitation and when it warned against settlement. The western wood, dense forest covering the impact crater's center, troubled the Shokopewa from their earliest encounters. Animals avoided the area without apparent cause. Plants grew twisted and stunted, their leaves darker than surrounding foliage. Water flowing from the region tasted wrong, carrying metallic bitterness that lingered on the tongue. Most significantly, people who ventured too deeply into the western wood reported disturbing sensations, feeling watched by malevolent presence, hearing whispers in languages predating human speech, experiencing terror without identifiable source. Initial contact with IT came through tragic disappearances. Young hunters pursuing game into the western wood failed to return. Search parties found only scattered belongings, blood-stained clothing, and signs of struggle against unknown adversary. The missing were never recovered, their bodies presumably consumed or dragged to depths the tribe couldn't access. These losses mounted slowly, occurring sporadically enough that patterns took generations to emerge fully. The Shokopewa possessed oral traditions explaining the world through spiritual framework. When confronted with inexplicable evil, they interpreted it through existing cosmology. The entity became known as the Galu, evil spirit dwelling in cursed earth. This naming represented an attempt to categorize and thereby gain power over the threat. If the Galu was spirit, then spiritual remedies might prove effective. Shamans and medicine people developed rituals intended to placate or banish the entity, meeting with varying success. Over centuries, the tribe accumulated knowledge about the Galu's nature and limitations. They observed that disappearances occurred cyclically, periods of intense danger, followed by decades of relative safety. They recognized that the entity couldn't pursue victims beyond certain boundaries, as if invisible barriers constrained its movement. They understood that the Galu fed particularly on children, though adults also fell victim when vulnerable. Most importantly, they discovered that the entity responded to human consciousness, manifesting forms drawn from individual fears and cultural nightmares. The breakthrough came through discovery of unusual stones scattered throughout the western wood. These fragments, unlike any mineral the Shokopewa had encountered, possessed strange properties. They remained ice-cold regardless of season or fire's heat. They reflected light in unnatural patterns, seeming to glow faintly even in complete darkness. Animals refused to approach them. More significantly, the fragments caused physical discomfort when handled, inducing nausea, dizziness, and overwhelming dread. Brave individuals willing to endure the fragments' effects, transported them from their original locations. They discovered that moving the stones altered the Galoo's territorial boundaries. Areas previously dangerous became safe when fragments were positioned as barriers. The entity, despite its power, could not cross these thresholds. This revelation transformed the tribe's relationship with the evil. They couldn't destroy the Galoo, but they could contain it, limiting its hunting ground and protecting themselves through strategic placement of the cosmic fragments. The containment process required generations of effort, knowledge passing from elders to young people, each adding refinement to protective barriers. The Shokopiwa mapped the Galoo's territory precisely, identifying every location where the entity had taken victims. They established perimeter using the star fragments, creating boundary the entity couldn't breach. This work demanded sacrifice, individuals risking their lives to place stones in dangerous locations, some falling victim to the Galoo before completing their tasks. The tribe developed strict protocols regarding the Western Wood. Children were taught from earliest age never to venture beyond marked boundaries. Adults entering the Forbidden Zone did so only in groups, armed with protective talismans and spiritual preparation. Even then, excursions remained brief and purposeful, gathering necessary resources before retreating to safety. This careful balance allowed the Shokopiwa to thrive while acknowledging evil's permanent presence. Despite containment success, the Galoo remained dangerous within its boundaries. The 27-year cycle continued, the entity awakening to feed on any who ignored warnings or suffered misfortune. During active periods, the tribe maintained constant vigilance, keeping children close, avoiding the Western Wood entirely, performing protective rituals. These measures reduced casualties but never eliminated them completely. The Galoo's hunger always found satisfaction, claiming victims through accident, foolishness, or simply overwhelming power. The Shokopiwa attempted more aggressive solutions. Shamans performed elaborate ceremonies intended to banish the entity permanently. These rituals, based on spiritual traditions adapted to confront cosmic evil, involved fasting, meditation, psychic confrontation, and symbolic warfare. The most advanced practitioners claimed to journey to spirit realm, where they could engage the Galoo directly, battling malevolent consciousness with strength of will and purity of spirit. These early versions of what would later be codified as the ritual of Chud met with partial success. The shamans who survived described entering vast darkness, where glowing lights beckoned, promising knowledge while threatening madness. They reported confronting the Galoo in its true form, incomprehensible and terrible. Some claimed victories, forcing the entity into retreat. Others returned broken, their minds shattered by what they witnessed. A few never returned at all, their consciousness consumed by the deadlights. The rituals accomplished containment but not destruction. The Galoo proved too ancient, too powerful, too fundamentally connected to the land for complete banishment. The best the Shokopiwa could achieve was forcing the entity into dormancy, shortening active periods, reducing victim counts. This represented significant achievement given the disparity between human and cosmic power. The tribe's spiritual warriors fought evil beyond human categories and survived to document their methods. Knowledge preservation became sacred duty. The Shokopiwa understood that each generation must learn from previous encounters. They developed sophisticated oral traditions, encoding information about the Galoo, safe boundaries, warning signs, protective measures, and ritual techniques. These traditions, passed through careful instruction, maintained consistency across centuries. Young people memorized lengthy narratives containing practical wisdom disguised as mythology. The tribe established permanent settlements outside the Galoo's range, refusing to build villages in cursed territory despite its resources. This decision cost them access to prime hunting grounds, valuable timber, and strategic locations. However, the Shokopiwa valued survival over convenience. they adapted to living beyond the Western wood, developing successful communities that lasted centuries. Their population grew, their culture flourished, all while maintaining careful watch on the contained evil. Interestingly, the tribe's relationship with the Galu evolved beyond simple antagonism. Some elders suggested the entity served purpose, teaching humans about courage, vigilance, and mortality. Children who learned to fear the Western wood developed healthy respect for danger. Adults who maintained protective rituals stayed connected to spiritual traditions. The Galu became perverse teacher, reminding the Shokopiwa that evil existed and required constant opposition. European contact began in the 17th century, bringing catastrophic disruption to established balance. The newcomers, carrying different worldviews and dismissing indigenous wisdom as superstition, ignored warnings about the Western wood. The Shokopiwa attempted to communicate danger, explaining through interpreters about the Galu and necessary precautions. The Europeans, confident in their weapons and religion, interpreted these warnings as attempts to monopolize territory or as evidence of primitive thinking. The tribal elders watched with growing dread as settlers established homesteads in forbidden areas. They knew what would follow: the Galu awakening to new prey, the cycle beginning again, with victims unfamiliar with protective measures. Some Shokopiwa attempted direct intervention, physically preventing settlers from entering dangerous zones, removing European structures built in cursed territory. These efforts met with hostility, settlers viewing indigenous people as obstacles rather than saviors. The relationship between Shokopiwa and settlers deteriorated rapidly. European diseases decimated tribal populations. Colonial authorities pushed indigenous people from traditional lands, disrupting centuries of careful boundary maintenance. The star fragments, without knowledgeable caretakers, were disturbed or removed. The protective perimeter collapsed, allowing the Galu expanded hunting ground. Worse, settlers' disregard for spiritual protocols meant they entered danger zones unprepared, becoming easy prey for entity suddenly presented with abundant victims. The Shokopiwa's decline and displacement meant loss of accumulated knowledge. Some information survived, passed to descendants who maintained oral traditions despite cultural disruption. Other wisdom disappeared entirely, elders dying before transmitting crucial details. The tribe's sophisticated understanding of the entity, its limitations, its cycles, its vulnerabilities, became fragmented. Later generations would need to rediscover through painful experience what the Shokopiwa had learned through centuries of careful observation. A few tribal families remained in the region, maintaining discreet presence as European dairy grew. These survivors preserved fragments of traditional knowledge, watching with resignation as the town experienced predictable horrors. Occasionally, they shared warnings with sympathetic listeners, explaining the old stories about the Galu and necessary precautions. Most settlers dismissed such advice, viewing it as quaint folklore rather than survival wisdom. The cycle continued as the Shokopiwa had foreseen, ignorance ensuring new victims each generation. The Shokopiwa's legacy persisted in subtle ways. Geographic names retained indigenous origins, commemorating the tribe's presence. Certain locations remained avoided by intuitive locales who couldn't articulate why but felt wrongness lingering. The star fragments, though disturbed, still exerted influence on the entity's movements. Most significantly, the tribe's ritual knowledge survived in attenuated form, waiting for circumstances that would require its rediscovery. The indigenous people's experience with IT demonstrated that human courage could confront cosmic horror and achieve partial victory. The Shokopiwa couldn't destroy the ancient evil, but they contained it, studied it, developed strategies for survival. Their methods, grounded in spiritual understanding and practical observation, proved more effective than European rationalism would initially achieve. The tribe's wisdom, dismissed as superstition, contained literal survival information that later generations desperately needed. The Shokopiwa's careful stewardship maintained fragile peace for generations, a balance that would shatter with the arrival of European ambition and ignorance. Their story represented humanity's first recorded success against IT, demonstrating that knowledge, courage, and respect for forces beyond human control could enable coexistence even with cosmic malevolence. The loss of this wisdom would cost Derry dearly in centuries to come. Derry was founded in 1715 by English settlers who chose the cursed land despite indigenous warnings, establishing a township that would endure more tragedy than any community deserved. The initial party consisted of families seeking opportunity in the New World, drawn by reports of fertile soil, abundant timber, and strategic location along waterways suitable for commerce. These pioneers possessed typical colonial confidence, viewing themselves as bringing civilization to wilderness, dismissing native peoples as obstacles to progress rather than repositories of crucial knowledge. The settlement grew methodically during its first decades. Colonists cleared forest for farmland, constructed homes and community buildings, established basic governance structures. The township attracted additional settlers drawn by available land and relative isolation from more established colonial centres. Within 20 years, Derry supported population of approximately 340 souls, including farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and their families. The community thrived economically, producing agricultural surplus and trading with neighbouring settlements. European settlers displayed characteristic disregard for Shokopiwa warnings about the Western Wood. When tribal representatives attempted to communicate danger through interpreters, colonists interpreted these efforts as territorial claims or attempts to monopolize hunting grounds. The warnings, delivered with urgency and supported by detailed descriptions of previous tragedies, were dismissed as superstitious nonsense, unworthy of Christian consideration. This attitude, common throughout colonial expansion, placed settlers in direct conflict with ancient evil they couldn't acknowledge. The colonists' worldview provided no framework for understanding cosmic horror. Their Christianity recognized spiritual evil, but conceptualized it differently than the entity actually present. They expected devils and demons that could be warded by faith and scripture. They anticipated threats fitting their theological categories, malevolence that operated according to familiar rules. It represented something outside their conceptual boundaries, evil that predated their religion and operated beyond its protections. This conceptual gap left them vulnerable, despite their conviction of divine favour. Early warnings manifested subtly. Livestock brought near the Western Wood became agitated without visible cause, refusing to graze despite abundant forage. Dogs exhibited unusual behaviour, whining pitifully and attempting to pull handlers away from certain areas. Children playing near boundaries reported seeing strange lights in the forest, hearing voices calling them deeper into trees. Adults dismissed these phenomena as imagination, animal skittishness, or natural occurrences misinterpreted through lack of wilderness experience. The first disappearances occurred sporadically, individual colonists vanishing under circumstances that raised questions but prompted no organised response. A young man hunting alone failed to return, searchers finding his musket but no body. A woman gathering herbs near forest edge was last seen entering tree line and never emerged. 2 children playing too far from settlement disappeared simultaneously, despite their parents' desperate searches. These losses, tragic but not unprecedented in frontier life, were attributed to accidents, animal attacks, or getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. The pattern accelerated as IT awakened fully to new prey. The entity, dormant for decades, stirred in response to concentrated population suddenly available. European settlers provided different sustenance than the Shokopiwa. their fears shaped by different culture, their imaginations filled with distinct nightmares. It adapted to this new food source with characteristic opportunism, learning what terrified these particular victims, manifesting forms drawn from their specific phobias and cultural anxieties. By 1740, disappearances occurred with alarming frequency. The 3-year period that followed represented one of IT's most sustained and devastating feeding frenzies. The entity, unrestricted by protective barriers the Shokopiwa had maintained, roamed throughout the settlement and surrounding areas. No location seemed safe. Victims taken from homes, fields, communal gatherings. The progression suggested methodical predation, IT systematically reducing the population while maximizing terror among survivors. The colonists attempted rational responses to escalating crisis. They organized armed patrols, posted guards at night, implemented curfews for children. These measures proved ineffective against threat that could appear as trusted friend, beloved family member, or manifestation of personal nightmare. It moved with supernatural efficiency, avoiding or overpowering physical defenses, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, turning the settlement's social structures against inhabitants. Community cohesion deteriorated as suspicion grew, each person wondering if neighbors might be responsible, or if unseen evil truly stalked them. Some settlers recognized supernatural nature of their persecution. These individuals, often those with lingering folk beliefs from European peasant traditions, attempted spiritual defenses. They blessed homes with holy water, hung protective symbols, recited prayers and incantations. A few sought out remaining Shokopiwa, begging for information about the Galu and methods for combating it. This minority received some traditional knowledge, including warnings about the entity's cyclical nature and territorial preferences. However, their warnings to fellow colonists met with ridicule or accusations of consorting with heathens. The disappearances followed distinct pattern within the 3-year period. Initial victims vanished completely, bodies never recovered, families left without closure or remains to bury. As the feeding frenzy intensified, IT became less meticulous about evidence. Blood-stained clothing appeared scattered along forest paths. Body parts were discovered in wells, streams, and cellars. The entity seemed to delight in leaving traces sufficient to terrorize survivors without providing enough information for effective response. This psychological warfare amplified the physical predation. Survivors described encounters with impossible phenomena. Multiple witnesses reported seeing loved ones who had disappeared, these apparitions beckoning them toward forest or dark places. Others saw enormous creatures lurking at settlement edges, forms that shifted between animal and human configuration. Children spoke of friendly clown visiting at night, performing tricks and offering treats before parents intervened. These accounts, documented in journals and letters that survived the period, provide historical record of IT's manifestations during active feeding. The winter of 1742 brought temporary respite as harsh weather, limited outdoor activity, and concentrated population in defensible locations. However, spring 1743 saw renewed aggression. The final phase of the 3-year cycle demonstrated its capacity for total devastation. Within months, the remaining settlers vanished almost simultaneously. Search parties from neighbouring townships found Derry completely abandoned, homes standing empty, food half-eaten on tables, personal possessions left behind, as if inhabitants had departed mid-activity, expecting immediate return. The physical evidence discovered by these search parties became legendary in colonial Maine. A trail of bloodied clothing led from various points in the settlement toward the old well house at the community's centre. Garments belonging to men, women, and children lay scattered along these converging paths, arranged almost deliberately to guide observers toward common destination. The well itself, when investigated, proved impossibly deep. its bottom invisible, even when lowered lanterns illuminated descent. No bodies were recovered from the well or anywhere else in the abandoned settlement. The resemblance to the lost Roanoke colony struck contemporary observers. Like that earlier disappearance, Derry's evacuation seemed to have occurred rapidly, without sign of struggle or preparation for departure. Unlike Roanoke's cryptic Croatoan carving, Derry provided no explanatory message. The settlers simply ceased existing in any recoverable form. This mystery generated speculation, ranging from indigenous attack to supernatural intervention, though official colonial records eventually attributed the loss to unspecified catastrophe or relocation. Its satisfaction, after consuming 340 settlers, allowed the entity to return to hibernation. The feeding frenzy had provided enormous sustenance, both physical and psychic. The terror experienced by the settlers, their desperate attempts at escape, their realization that no help would arrive, all contributed to the feast. This cycle established Ait's preference for concentrated populations, communities large enough to generate sustained fear while remaining manageable as hunting ground. The land where Derry had stood remained empty for several years. Neighbouring communities avoided the cursed site, spreading stories about the mysterious disappearances. However, economic pressure and population growth eventually overcame superstition. The township was refounded in the late 1740s by settlers, either unaware of or dismissive regarding previous tragedies. These new inhabitants claimed cleared land, repaired existing structures, and re-established community that would continue growing despite its dark foundation. The refounding demonstrated pattern that would repeat across Derry's history. Each generation arrived with insufficient knowledge of previous horrors. Official records mentioned earlier settlement failures, but attributed them to conventional causes, war, disease, or simple abandonment. The supernatural truth remained hidden, dismissed as folklore unworthy of serious consideration. This collective amnesia ensured that each cycle of IT's awakening found unprepared victims who lacked knowledge to protect themselves effectively. The new Derry grew more cautiously than its predecessor. Some folk memory persisted, manifesting as vague unease about certain locations, reluctance to venture into specific forest areas, superstitions about the old well. These attenuated warnings provided minimal protection, but indicated that complete forgetting proved impossible. The land itself retained memory of what occurred, that wrongness seeping into residents' consciousness, even when explicit knowledge disappeared. The period between 1743 and IT's next major awakening allowed the settlement to establish stronger foundations. Population grew steadily, economic activity diversified beyond agriculture, social institutions developed. The community attracted artisans, merchants, and professionals who added complexity to what had been simple farming settlement. This growth meant future awakenings would target larger populations with more elaborate social structures to exploit. The indigenous peoples who witnessed Derry's refounding maintained their discreet presence, watching with resignation as colonists rebuilt on cursed ground. The Shakapiwa who remained in the region understood the cycle would continue, that each generation would suffer losses, that the Galu's hunger remained undiminished. Some attempted periodic warnings to sympathetic settlers, sharing fragments of traditional knowledge. These efforts met with mixed reception, a few taking precautions, while most dismissed indigenous wisdom as primitive superstition. The first cycle established patterns that would repeat across centuries, a rhythmic horror that became woven into Derry's very foundation. The 27-year intervals, the preferential targeting of children, the manifestation of personalized fears, the collective amnesia following each feeding, all these elements appeared in nascent form during the colonial period. Later generations would experience variations on these themes, but the fundamental dynamics remained consistent from Derry's earliest days. The colonial cycle also demonstrated IT's adaptability. The entity learned from each encounter, refining techniques for maximum terror and efficiency. The settlers' Christian worldview, their firearms, their rational mindset, none provided effective defense against evil that operated outside their conceptual frameworks. This would prove true for future generations as well, each believing their superior knowledge or technology would succeed where previous attempts failed. The 19th century brought industrial prosperity to Derry alongside cyclical horror, each generation experiencing tragedy that residents explained away rather than confronted. The rebuilt township matured into proper town during this period, developing infrastructure, establishing institutions, and attracting diverse population drawn by economic opportunities. Lumber mills, textile factories, and agricultural commerce transformed Derry from frontier settlement into thriving community. This growth concentrated population in ways that would later prove advantageous for IT's feeding patterns. The awakening of 1851 began not with IT directly consuming victims, but with the entity's influence, driving humans to commit atrocities. John Markson, respected citizen and prosperous merchant, experienced deterioration of mental state throughout early spring that year. Neighbours reported hearing arguments from the Markson household, witnessing uncharacteristic outbursts, observing the family's increasing isolation. These warning signs, obvious in retrospect, prompted no intervention at the time. Victorian sensibilities discouraged involvement in private family matters, leaving the Marksons to face mounting crisis alone. May 1851 brought the horrifying conclusion. Markson poisoned his entire family during evening meal, administering toxin to his wife and 3 children before consuming a larger dose himself. The poison chosen, extract from white nightshade mushrooms, caused excruciating death over several hours. Victims experienced violent convulsions, hallucinations, respiratory distress, and organ failure. The suffering was prolonged and terrible, the Markson home becoming chamber of agony before silence finally descended. Discovery came when Markson failed to open his shop for several consecutive days. Concerned business associates forced entry to the family home, finding all 5 bodies in various stages of decomposition. The scene suggested Markson had watched his family die before succumbing himself, his position near his wife and children indicating he remained conscious through their final moments. Investigation revealed evidence of methodical planning, Markson having acquired the nightshade weeks earlier, carefully extracting and preparing the poison, choosing the method that would cause maximum suffering. The question of motivation troubled Derry citizens. Markson showed no obvious signs of financial distress, marital discord, or psychological disturbance beyond the final weeks. His journal, discovered during investigation, contained increasingly disturbed entries describing voices in the walls, visions of laughing figures at window, overwhelming conviction that his family faced fate worse than death. The final entry, written hours before the poisoning, consisted of single phrase, repeated dozens of times, better this way, better this way, better this way. Its role in the Markson tragedy operated through psychological manipulation rather than direct predation. The entity fed on the family's terror as poison took effect, savouring each moment of their suffering. However, IT also derived satisfaction from corrupting Markson himself, twisting loving father into murderer, demonstrating that evil could work through human hands as effectively as supernatural manifestation. This approach allowed IT to feed while remaining invisible, the tragedy attributed to human madness rather than supernatural influence. The community response followed predictable patterns. The Markson family received burial in consecrated ground despite the murder-suicide, townspeople extending sympathy rather than condemnation. Explanations ranged from undiagnosed illness to financial pressures kept hidden. No one seriously considered supernatural causation. The incident became a cautionary tale about recognizing mental disturbance in neighbors, practical lesson stripped of its true significance. Within years, details faded, the Markson name gradually forgotten, the house eventually occupied by new residents, unaware of its history. It returned to dormancy after the 1851 cycle, satisfied by the elaborate terror it had orchestrated. The hiatus lasted until the mid-1870s, Derry continuing to grow and prosper during this peaceful interval. The lumber industry expanded dramatically as forests surrounding the town provided valuable timber. Logging camps established throughout the region employed hundreds of workers, many living in rough conditions far from town proper. These isolated camps, populated by transient workers with limited social connections, would provide ideal hunting ground for IT's next awakening. The 1876 cycle began with disappearances among the lumberjack community. Men working timber operations near Kentuskeg Stream failed to return from shifts, their bodies discovered days or weeks later in various states. The deaths displayed unusual characteristics that troubled even hardened woodsmen, accustomed to industrial accidents and natural hazards. Victims bore wounds that didn't match equipment injuries, displayed expressions of profound terror frozen at moment of death, showed evidence of being pursued through forest by something that moved faster and more intelligently than any known animal. The lumberjack murders continued sporadically through 1879, claiming lives across 3 years of IT's active period. The victims shared certain commonalities beyond their profession. Most were isolated individuals with minimal family connections, drifters working seasonal contracts before moving to next opportunity. Their disappearances attracted less attention than tragedies involving established residents, allowing IT to feed with reduced risk of organised response. The entity demonstrated strategic intelligence in target selection, choosing prey whose absence would be noted but not extensively investigated. Near Kentuskeg Stream, certain locations acquired reputations for danger among the lumber workers. Experienced men warned newcomers about specific clearings where comrades had vanished, particular stretches of waterway where bodies had been found. These warnings, transmitted through oral tradition of the camps, provided some protection while reinforcing superstitious atmosphere. The lumberjacks developed elaborate folklore attempting to explain the dangers, stories of vengeful spirits, cursed ground, or savage beasts unknown to science. Some workers reported encounters they survived, descriptions that varied wildly in details but shared core elements. A presence in the forest that watched from beyond firelight, voices calling from darkness, mimicking friends or loved ones left behind. Glimpses of figures that seemed wrong, proportions subtly distorted, movements unnaturally fluid. Overwhelming compulsion to leave safety and venture into dangerous areas despite rational knowledge of risk. These accounts, dismissed by educated townspeople as superstitious nonsense, contained accurate observations about IT's methodology. The authorities proved ineffective at addressing the crisis. Local law enforcement, unprepared for investigating deaths occurring in remote forest locations, attributed most fatalities to industrial accidents, animal attacks, or natural causes. The few cases recognized as potential murders focused investigation on human perpetrators, searches for killer among the logging crews themselves. This misdirection suited IT perfectly, allowing the entity to continue feeding while official responses targeted wrong threats entirely. One investigation came closer to truth than others realized. A particularly persistent sheriff documented pattern in the deaths, noting the 27-year interval since the Markson tragedy, observing similarities in circumstances despite differences in victim profiles. His report, filed with county authorities, suggested cyclical phenomenon affecting Derry and recommended comparative analysis of historical records to identify previous occurrences. The recommendation went unheeded, the sheriff's theory dismissed as overly imaginative. The report itself disappeared from official files, destroyed, misfiled, or deliberately removed by forces ensuring knowledge remained suppressed. Derry's established residents largely ignored the lumberjack deaths, viewing them as unrelated to respectable town life. Class divisions between mill workers and middle-class citizens created psychological distance that discouraged empathy. The victims weren't real residents of Derry in eyes of long-time inhabitants, merely transient labour passing through. This social fragmentation served IT's purposes admirably, preventing unified response that might have identified patterns or developed effective countermeasures. The cycle concluded in late 1879 with the entity returning to hibernation after sufficient feeding. The murders ceased abruptly, a fact noted by survivors, but unexplained by any theory involving human culprits or natural causes. The logging industry continued operating in the area despite the deaths, economic imperatives overriding safety concerns. New workers arrived to replace those lost, most unaware of the specific dangers they faced. The collective amnesia that characterized Derry's relationship with IT ensured that knowledge didn't accumulate effectively across generations. The psychological mechanism enabling this forgetting fascinated later researchers who discovered Derry's history. The human mind possessed remarkable capacity for rationalizing inexplicable events, constructing comfortable narratives that preserved sense of order and predictability. When confronted with evidence of supernatural evil, most people instinctively rejected such conclusions, instead accepting explanations that fit existing worldview regardless of logical inconsistencies. This cognitive bias, combined with IT's subtle influence encouraging forgetfulness, meant that explicit warnings rarely survived to benefit future generations. Documentation from the period revealed another troubling pattern. Those who did recognize supernatural elements in the tragedies, who attempted to warn others or take protective action, frequently met untimely ends themselves. Accidents, sudden illnesses, or simply disappearances removed potential truth-tellers before their knowledge could spread. Whether this represented IT directly eliminating threats or merely selective pressure favoring ignorance over awareness remained unclear. The effect was identical, regardless of mechanism. The 1876-1879 cycle established IT's expanding range of methodologies: direct predation on lumberjacks, psychological manipulation driving the Markson murders, and broader influence maintaining community-wide denial, all demonstrated the entity's versatility. Future cycles would build on these approaches, IT continuously refining techniques for maximum efficiency. The 19th century awakenings proved that ancient evil could adapt to changing social conditions, remaining relevant and dangerous despite technological progress and evolving cultural attitudes. These early cycles demonstrated IT's dual nature, directly consuming some victims while inspiring others to commit atrocities, feeding on fear and violence interchangeably. The century's tragedies showed how evil could work through multiple channels simultaneously, making detection and resistance more difficult. By the time observers recognized one pattern, the entity had shifted to different approach, staying perpetually ahead of human understanding. The early 20th century's industrial optimism transformed Derry into a manufacturing centre, concentrating population and creating conditions for IT's most devastating awakening yet. Factories lined the Kentuskeg stream, their machinery, powered by water, channeled through elaborate mill races. The Kitchener Ironworks, largest employer in the region, dominated the town's economy and skyline, its smokestacks visible for miles. Workers' housing clustered near industrial sites, families living in close quarters, children playing in streets, and vacant lots between shifts. This density, celebrated as sign of progress and prosperity, created ideal hunting ground for an entity that fed on accessible prey. The lumber industry remained significant despite industrial diversification. Logging camps surrounding Derry supplied timber for construction, furniture, manufacture, and export. These camps maintained rough character from previous decades, populated by transient workers whose labour sustained the town's economic engine. Unionisation efforts emerged during this period, workers organising to demand better wages and safer conditions. The resulting tensions between labour and management added volatility to social atmosphere already marked by ethnic divisions, class stratification, and economic inequality. Claude Hérault arrived in Derry during the early 1900s, French-Canadian lumberjack, whose background differed little from hundreds of similar workers. He laboured in camps north of town, sending wages home to family in Quebec, participating in seasonal rhythms of logging work. Fellow workers remembered Hérault as quiet, competent, generally unremarkable. No evidence suggested predisposition toward violence or psychological instability. His transformation from ordinary labourer to mass murderer exemplified IT's capacity to corrupt individuals for purposes beyond simple feeding. The tensions preceding the massacre developed throughout 1903 and early 1904. Hérault's logging camp experienced labour disputes, workers attempting to organise union while camp bosses resisted. Several union sympathisers disappeared in circumstances that raised suspicions among remaining workers. Bodies discovered weeks later showed signs of violence inconsistent with industrial accidents. The camp's atmosphere grew increasingly hostile, accusations flying between factions, paranoia replacing collegial relationships that had existed previously. April 1904 brought the Sleepy Silver Dollar Massacre. Hérault entered the Rough Tavern where many camp workers spent leisure time, carrying axe he used professionally. Witnesses later testified that he appeared calm, almost serene, as he walked through the crowded room. Without warning or apparent provocation, Hérault began methodically attacking patrons, particularly those known for anti-union sentiments. The assault lasted approximately 15 minutes, Hérault moving through the tavern with terrible efficiency, striking down 12 men before the surviving crowd overwhelmed and restrained him. The violence displayed characteristics suggesting more than simple rage or revenge. Hérault killed with precision, each blow calculated for maximum lethality. He showed no emotion during the attack, no shouting or visible anger. Survivors described his face as blank, almost peaceful, as if he were performing necessary tasks rather than committing atrocities. This dissociation troubled observers, the disconnect between action and affect, suggesting something beyond conventional psychology. Investigation revealed complex background to the massacre. The 12 victims included several men involved in earlier disappearances of union organisers. Some had participated in beatings of workers who advocated for better conditions. Others had served as informants for company management, identifying troublemakers for termination or worse. Hérault had witnessed these injustices, had seen friends and colleagues suffer. However, his response transcended proportional justice, becoming wholesale slaughter that shocked even those sympathetic to Labour's grievances. The public response divided along predictable lines. Labour supporters viewed Hérault as victim driven to extremes by systematic oppression and possibly justified violence. Management and middle-class residents condemned him as savage criminal whose actions proved working-class unfitness for civilized society. Neither faction seriously considered supernatural influence, though several witnesses mentioned strange details. One testified that during the massacre, he glimpsed a peculiar figure at the tavern's periphery, someone dressed oddly, watching events with apparent amusement. This testimony, dismissed as confusion during traumatic events, went uninvestigated. Authorities arrested Hérault immediately, though he offered no resistance once restrained. He appeared confused about what had occurred, asking repeatedly what he had done, claiming no memory of the massacre. This amnesia, whether genuine or feigned, prevented meaningful interrogation. Medical examination found no evidence of intoxication or obvious mental illness. Hiro simply couldn't or wouldn't explain his actions, remaining bewildered prisoner until vigilante justice intervened. The mob formed within hours of the massacre. Enraged citizens, both workers outraged by Hiro's betrayal of Labour's cause and companymen seeking vengeance for killed associates, converged on the jail. Local law enforcement, overwhelmed and possibly sympathetic, offered minimal resistance. The crowd extracted Hiro and conducted summary execution by hanging, the lynch mob's composition cutting across usual social divisions. In moment of collective violence, Derry's residents united to destroy the man who had shattered their community's fragile peace. Witnesses to the lynching reported curious detail subsequently forgotten or dismissed. Among the mob, someone stood out for unusual appearance, described variously as wearing old-fashioned costume, face painted white, expression unnaturally cheerful. This figure participated enthusiastically in the execution, seeming to take particular pleasure in the proceedings. Later attempts to identify this individual failed completely, no one able to name the mysteriously dressed participant despite the mob consisting primarily of local residents who should have recognized each other. Its role in the Hiro affair operated on multiple levels. The entity had likely influenced or directly caused the disappearances that provoked labour tensions. Certainly, E.T. corrupted Hiro himself, using existing grievances as foundation for possession or extreme manipulation. The massacre provided rich feeding opportunity, terror of victims and witnesses alike, satisfying the entity's hunger. Finally, IT participated in the lynching, openly joining human violence while remaining unrecognized, demonstrating the entity's confidence and growing boldness. The aftermath saw Derry attempting to process unprecedented violence. The community erected no memorial, held no collective mourning, sought no deeper understanding of what had occurred. Instead, the massacre became something to be forgotten as quickly as possible, embarrassing episode reflecting poorly on town's civilized pretensions. Within years, the Sleepy Silver Dollar closed permanently, the building eventually demolished. The story survived primarily as cautionary tale about labor radicalism's dangers, sanitized version that erased complexities and supernatural elements. 2 years after the Hiro massacre, as IT approached peak activity in its cycle, the entity orchestrated its most devastating mass casualty event to date. The Kitchener Ironworks, seeking to demonstrate community goodwill and distract from ongoing labour tensions, planned elaborate Easter celebration for 1906. The event would combine egg hunt for children with picnic for families, creating festive atmosphere that showcased the company's benevolence. Management advertised extensively, encouraging workers and townspeople to attend with their children, promising prizes, refreshments, and entertainment. Easter Sunday, 1906, drew enormous crowd to the ironworks facility. Parents and children arrived throughout morning, gathering in spaces between machinery and buildings. The company had shut down all operations for the holiday. Every furnace cold, every machine still. Safety inspectors had verified that no equipment posed danger. The facility essentially converted into large park for the day's festivities. The atmosphere was joyful, families enjoying rare opportunity for leisure in an environment usually associated with dangerous labour. The egg hunt began mid-morning, hundreds of children dispersing across the ironworks grounds, searching for hidden prizes. Parents watched indulgently, many participating themselves, the event fostering community spirit that temporarily bridged social divisions. For a brief period, Derry seemed united, focused on simple pleasure of children enjoying holiday rather than fractured by economic and ethnic tensions. This moment of collective happiness and innocence made the subsequent tragedy even more devastating. The explosion occurred without warning at approximately 11 o'clock. Despite all machines being shut down, despite thorough safety inspections, despite no obvious ignition source, the ironworks erupted in catastrophic blast that destroyed several buildings and killed 102 people instantly. The devastation was total and inexplicable, investigators later unable to determine any natural cause. Machinery that had been cold for hours somehow achieved conditions necessary for massive explosion, defying all physical principles and safety protocols. The death toll included 88 children, concentrated in areas where the egg hunt had drawn them. The explosion specifically targeted locations where young victims congregated, as if designed for maximum child casualties. Parents watching from safer distances witnessed their children's destruction, survivors bearing psychological scars that never healed. The screams, the chaos, the desperate searches through wreckage for missing children created scenes of horror that haunted Derry for generations. 8 bodies were never recovered, victims presumably consumed by fires or disintegrated by explosion's force. However, some survivors reported seeing impossible things in immediate aftermath. Figures moving through smoke and flames, unharmed, seemingly collecting something from the wreckage. Laughter heard among the screams, joyful and terrible. A man dressed in unusual costume, carrying balloons despite the devastation, walking calmly through the disaster. These reports, attributed to shock and trauma, never received serious investigation. The official inquiry concluded that unknown equipment malfunction caused the explosion, despite contradicting all available evidence. The company faced no criminal charges, investigators accepting impossibility of determining specific cause. Civil suits brought by victims' families settled for modest compensation, plaintiffs lacking resources to challenge powerful corporation. The ironworks resumed operations within months, management implementing additional safety measures while maintaining the explosion remained inexplicable accident rather than negligence or sabotage. In weeks following the disaster, several witnesses reported strange phenomena. Children's voices heard near the ruins at night, giggling and playing despite no living children present. Balloons appearing mysteriously, floating through town or tied to lampposts, their origin unknown. Most disturbingly, some parents claimed seeing their deceased children in crowds or at distances, the apparitions vanishing when approached. These experiences, dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations, represented E.T. savouring the aftermath of its greatest massacre. The Kitchener Ironworks tragedy marked evolution in IT's methodology. Previous cycles involved individual predation or inspiring human violence. The 1906 explosion demonstrated the entity's capacity for direct, large-scale destruction when circumstances permitted. The careful preparation, gathering victims in single location, creating conditions for mass casualty event, showed sophisticated planning beyond simple opportunistic feeding. IT had learned to engineer disasters that provided abundant sustenance while maintaining plausible deniability as natural or human-caused tragedy. The psychological impact on Derry extended. Beyond immediate grief, the town had gathered in celebration, community briefly unified in joy, only to experience collective trauma that reinforced divisions and suspicions. Some blamed the company for negligence despite investigations' conclusions. Others suspected sabotage by radical labour elements, pointing to Hero massacre as precedent. A few whispered about curses, suggesting the town itself was damned. None publicly acknowledged supernatural causation, though many privately harboured such suspicions. Its satisfaction after the 1906 massacre enabled prolonged hibernation. The entity had fed magnificently, consuming not just lives but innocence, transforming Easter celebration into charnel house, demonstrating its power over even modern industrial society's mightiest achievements. The emotional resonance of the tragedy, parents' grief, survivors' trauma, community's shame, all provided rich psychic nourishment that sustained IT through coming decades. The cycle concluded with evil triumphant, Derry left to rebuild both physically and psychologically from devastation that officially never had supernatural explanation. The Kitchener Ironworks tragedy represented a horrifying evolution, IT's realization that concentrated gatherings of children provided efficient feeding opportunities, while community-wide events generated terror that extended beyond immediate victims. The industrial age, which humans believed demonstrated mastery over nature and superstition's defeat, had instead provided new tools for ancient evil to exploit. Economic collapse following the 1929 stock market crash created conditions of desperation that extended far beyond Wall Street, reaching small towns like Derry, where financial hardship intersected with supernatural malevolence. The Great Depression transformed American society, unemployment reaching unprecedented levels, families losing homes and savings, social fabric straining under pressure. Derry's economy, dependent on manufacturing and timber, suffered severely as demand for goods evaporated and credit disappeared. The resulting anxiety, fear, and anger created psychological climate that IT could exploit with characteristic opportunism. The Bradley Gang represented typical Depression-era criminality, outlaws who viewed bank robbery as redistribution rather than theft. Brothers Al and George Bradley led organisation that included Cal and Joe Conklin, Arthur Malloy known as Creeping Jesus, Patrick Cordy, George's common-law wife, Kitty Donahue, and Cordy's sometime girlfriend, Marie Hauser. The gang operated primarily in Midwest during early 1930s, robbing 6 or 7 banks across multiple states. Their methods combined violence with careful planning, reconnaissance of targets, quick execution, immediate departure from crime scenes. The gang's activities escalated from simple robbery to kidnapping and murder. They abducted banker from Iowa institution, demanding $30,000 ransom. Despite receiving payment, they killed their hostage, decision that transformed them from romanticized outlaws into wanted murderers. Federal authorities prioritized their capture, coordinating with local law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. By late 1929, the Bradley Gang faced increasing pressure, their options narrowing as safe havens disappeared. Derry attracted the gang as temporary refuge, small town far from their usual operating territory, connected by adequate roads for escape if necessary, large enough to blend in, but not so large as to maintain extensive law enforcement. The outlaws arrived separately during autumn 1929, occupying rented rooms under assumed names, maintaining low profiles while planning next moves. For several weeks they succeeded in avoiding detection, their presence unknown to local authorities, focused on managing Depression's local impacts. The gang's downfall came through routine transaction. They arranged to collect shipment of ammunition from Marchand's Sporting Goods on Canal Street, necessary supply for whatever operations they planned next. This commercial interaction, seemingly innocuous, somehow came to authorities' attention. Whether through informant, suspicious store owner, or simple misfortune remained unclear. What became evident was that Derry citizens and police learned of the gang's presence and decided to take action without involving federal authorities who might claim credit or split any reward. The ambush occurred in broad daylight on Canal Street during late afternoon when pedestrian and vehicle traffic would provide witnesses. Townspeople and police positioned themselves in buildings overlooking the street, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols. When gang members arrived at Marchand's to collect their ammunition, the shooting began immediately. The fusillade was overwhelming, dozens of weapons firing simultaneously, gang members cut down within seconds. The violence exceeded what was necessary for simple capture or even justified self-defense. The shooters continued firing long after targets stopped moving, riddling bodies and vehicle with hundreds of bullets. This excess suggested emotional release beyond professional law enforcement, collective rage finding outlet in sanctioned killing. The depression's frustrations, economic anxiety, resentment toward those who took rather than earned, all channeled into prolonged execution, disguised as righteous violence. Witnesses to the Canal Street massacre reported details subsequently forgotten or suppressed. Among the shooters, one figure stood out for unusual appearance and behavior. Descriptions varied, some mentioning old-fashioned costume, others noting face paint or theatrical makeup, most agreeing on unsettling cheerfulness that contrasted with grim determination shown by other participants. This individual fired enthusiastically, laughed during the shooting, seemed to take particular joy in the carnage. Attempts to identify this person afterward failed completely, no one able to provide name despite the shooter's prominent visibility during the event. The gang's bodies, riddled with bullets, were displayed publicly before burial, gruesome trophy of community's triumph over criminality. The bullet-torn vehicle remained on Canal Street for days, physical evidence of violence and warning to other potential lawbreakers. Photography of the scene circulated regionally, Derry briefly achieving notoriety for its decisive handling of dangerous criminals. Official accounts credited local law enforcement exclusively, no mention made of federal involvement or the suspicious presence of the unusually dressed participant. Its participation in the Bradley Gang massacre demonstrated the entity's growing boldness. Where previous manifestations had occurred primarily in darkness or isolation, the Canal Street shooting happened in daylight before numerous witnesses. IT stood among human shooters, openly participating in violence, confident that collective psychology and its own influence would prevent recognition or acknowledgement. This confidence proved justified, the entity successfully embedding itself in community violence while remaining effectively invisible. The massacre satisfied IT's hunger partially, the gang members' terror and pain providing sustenance. However, the real feast came from broader community impact. The sanctioned violence, the collective guilt hidden beneath self-righteousness, the knowledge that Derry citizens had enthusiastically killed rather than captured. This psychological corruption, turning ordinary people into executioners, fed IT as richly as direct predation. The entity had learned to weaponize human darkness, making accomplices of entire communities. The official narrative surrounding the Bradley Gang's elimination avoided uncomfortable questions. Town leaders emphasized the gang's dangerous criminality, the necessity of decisive action, the heroism of those who protected the community. No investigation examined whether capture might have been possible, whether the level of violence was justified, whether due process had been completely abandoned. The collective decision to accept a sanitized version of events represented another instance of Derry's characteristic willingness to avoid truth in favor of comfortable fiction. The following year brought related tragedy that revealed deeper dimensions of IT's influence and Derry's moral failures. The Black Spot nightclub emerged during the late 1920s as a response to racial segregation affecting black soldiers stationed at nearby military installation. These servicemen, having fought for their country, returned home to Jim Crow restrictions that denied them access to most civilian establishments. The Black Spot provided rare space where black soldiers and local black residents could socialize, enjoy music, and experience community without white supremacist interference. The nightclub, located on the outskirts of Derry, proper attracted prominent musicians and developed reputation for excellent jazz performances. The venue represented more than mere entertainment. serving as cultural institution, safe haven, and symbol of black autonomy in hostile environment. White supremacists viewed it with growing resentment, seeing the nightclub's success as challenge to racial hierarchies they sought to maintain. The Maine Legion of White Decency, northern equivalent to the Ku Klux Klan, targeted the Black Spot for destruction. The attack came without warning on humid summer night in 1930. The nightclub was crowded, patrons enjoying performance, dancing, socializing an atmosphere of temporary freedom from outside world's hostility. The Maine Legion arrived after careful planning, surrounding the building, blocking exits, preparing for systematic elimination of everyone inside. The arsonists ignited fires at multiple points simultaneously, flames spreading rapidly through wooden structure while armed men prevented escape. The burning of the Black Spot exemplified intersection of human evil and supernatural malevolence. The white supremacists acted from their own hatred, requiring no supernatural influence to commit atrocity. However, Ite's presence transformed simple arson into something more terrible. Witnesses who survived reported seeing enormous bird-like creature in flames and smoke, wingspan impossible for natural animal, movement suggesting intelligence and purpose. This entity, clearly IT in another manifestation, moved through the fire collecting victims, feeding on their terror before the flames could claim them. Among those trapped in the burning Black Spot was a young man named Dick Halloran, working in the nightclub's kitchen to earn money during military service. Halloran possessed unusual abilities, psychic sensitivity that would later be termed shining, capability to perceive things beyond normal sensory range. These gifts, marginally developed in 1930, activated fully during the Black Spot fire. Halloran sensed the bird creature's presence, understood intuitively that supernatural evil worked alongside human hatred, used his abilities to help others find paths through smoke and flames. Halloran's psychic intervention saved several lives, his consciousness guiding trapped patrons toward exits that the Legion's blockade hadn't completely sealed. He moved through impossible heat and smoke, seemingly protected by same abilities that allowed him to perceive the threat's true nature. His heroism during the Black Spot fire represented rare instance of human supernatural capability successfully opposing IT's predation. The entity noticed Halloran, marked him psychically, though it couldn't prevent his escape. Many others weren't so fortunate. Dozens died in the flames or from smoke inhalation, their bodies discovered after the fire burned itself out. Some victims showed unusual injuries, wounds that didn't match fire damage or smoke inhalation, suggesting additional cause of death beyond what official investigation would conclude. The Legion members disappeared before authorities arrived, their identity known to black survivors, but officially unacknowledged by white law enforcement that sympathized with supremacist ideology, if not specific methods. Mike Hanlon's father survived the Black Spot fire, though the experience left permanent psychological scars. His testimony, recorded years later, provided detailed account of the bird creature and its behavior. The elder Hanlon described watching the entity move through flames unharmed, its attention focused on victims' terror rather than their physical bodies, its presence somehow more horrifying than the fire itself. His son Mike would later use this information when researching IT's history, the Black Spot becoming crucial evidence of the entity's cyclical nature and various manifestations. The official response to the Black Spot burning followed predictable patterns of racial injustice. Authorities attributed the fire to electrical malfunction despite obvious evidence of arson. No arrests were made, the Maine Legion's involvement officially unacknowledged. Insurance companies denied claims, arguing that the nightclub operators bore responsibility through inadequate safety measures. The black community, lacking political power or legal resources, couldn't force proper investigation or obtain justice for murdered friends and family members. The Black Spot's destruction sent clear message about racial hierarchy in Depression-era Derry. Black citizens were to remain invisible, occupy subordinate positions, avoid any display of prosperity or cultural autonomy. The white supremacist violence, tacitly endorsed by authorities' refusal to investigate, established boundaries that most black residents understood must not be crossed. This systematic oppression created atmosphere of fear that IT found as nourishing as individual terror, the entity feeding on collective anxiety, maintaining racist social order. Its appearance as giant bird during the Black Spot fire demonstrated the entity's adaptability to different cultural fears and contexts. Where it manifested as clown for children or personalized nightmares for individuals, it became bird for victims whose African American cultural heritage included different symbolic associations. The entity read collective consciousness, manifesting as appropriate terror for specific circumstances. This flexibility made it a nearly universal predator, capable of hunting across cultural, ethnic, and social boundaries. The Depression-era cycle concluded after the Black Spot burning, IT satisfied by combined feeding from both the Bradley Gang massacre and the nightclub fire. The entity returned to hibernation, dormant period stretching toward next awakening in late 1950s. Derry continued existing, depression gradually easing, World War II bringing economic recovery through military contracts and industrial production. The town grew and prospered during the mid-20th century, collective amnesia once again ensuring that new generations arrived unprepared for evil that slept beneath their streets. The Depression-era cycle revealed its opportunistic nature, amplifying existing human cruelty while directly feeding on resulting terror. The Bradley Gang massacre and Black Spot fire, while rooted in human evil ranging from vigilante violence to racial hatred, were enhanced and exploited by supernatural presence that transformed ordinary atrocities into elaborate feeding opportunities. The cycle demonstrated that IT needed not create all evil itself, merely recognize and magnify darkness already present in human hearts. The autumn of 1957 brought an ordinary tragedy that catalyzed extraordinary courage when 6-year-old Georgie Denbrough encountered a clown in a storm drain. October rain had fallen steadily that morning, turning Derry's streets into rushing streams that carried leaves, debris, and paper boats towards sewers. Young Georgie, confined indoors by illness that kept his older brother Bill home from school, received handmade boat crafted from notebook paper, carefully waterproofed with paraffin. The simple gift, made by Bill to ease his brother's boredom, became catalyst for events that would define Derry's relationship with ancient evil for generation. Georgie ventured out despite the rain, drawn by excitement of watching his boat navigate flooded gutters. The papercraft performed admirably, bobbing through currents, surviving minor collisions with curbs and debris. The boy followed his boat's progress with delight, temporarily forgetting his illness, in pure joy of play. This innocence, this moment of childhood happiness, unmarred by knowledge of danger, made what followed particularly cruel. The boat eventually disappeared into storm drain at intersection of Witcham and Jackson, leading Georgie to peer into darkness, seeking his lost toy. The clown that emerged from the shadows introduced itself as Pennywise the dancing clown, voice friendly, manner cheerful, appearance designed to attract rather than frighten children. Pennywise offered to return the boat, engaged Georgie in conversation about circus, balloons, and cotton candy. The entity demonstrated remarkable psychological sophistication, reading the child's desires and fears, calibrating its approach to maximize trust before striking. The conversation lasted several minutes, Georgie initially nervous but gradually relaxing as the clown seemed harmless and entertaining. The attack came suddenly, Pennywise's arm extending impossibly from the drain, grabbing Georgie with strength beyond human capacity. The child's screams attracted no immediate attention, rain and wind muffling sound in empty residential street. Georgie's disappearance was discovered within the hour when he failed to return home, Bill realizing something had gone wrong. Search parties formed quickly, neighbours and police, scouring the neighbourhood, finding Georgie's torn raincoat near the storm drain, but no trace of the boy himself. Its awakening had been triggered days earlier by different tragedy. Dorsey Corcoran, younger brother of Eddie Corcoran, had been beaten to death by his stepfather, Richard Macklin, an incident that attracted minimal official attention. The violence that killed Dorsey, combined with the approaching 27-year interval since the Black Spot fire, stirred it from hibernation. The entity began hunting immediately, Georgie becoming the first publicly acknowledged victim, though likely not the first child taken during the autumn of 1957. The following months saw additional disappearances that terrified Derry's residents. Betty Ripsome vanished in December, her absence initially attributed to running away from troubled home. Edward Corcoran, Dorsey's older brother, disappeared in June 1958 after trying to escape his abusive stepfather. Patrick Hochstetter, psychopathic teenager who had been tormenting smaller children, was found dead near the canal in circumstances that suggested animal attack, though witnesses reported seeing him enter areas where he shouldn't have been. Each loss added to mounting panic among parents, while children developed elaborate theories about what hunted them. The summer of 1958 brought together 7 children who would become known as the Losers Club, united by shared experiences of being outsiders and targeted by both supernatural and human threats. Bill Denbrough, Georgie's older brother, carried crushing guilt about the paper boat that had lured his brother to his doom. Bill's stutter, worsening after Georgie's death, made him target for bullies, while also marking him as leader among the outcasts. His determination to understand what had taken Georgie drove the group's eventual confrontation with IT. Richie Tozier brought humour to the group, using various voices and constant commentary to deflect attention from his own insecurities. His parents' benign neglect left him seeking connection elsewhere, finding family among the other losers. Richie's quick wit and loyalty masked deeper fears, particularly his terror of clowns and overwhelming anxiety about losing the friends he'd finally found. His glasses, thick and frequently broken during encounters with bullies, symbolized his vulnerability despite outward confidence. Eddie Kasprak lived under his mother's smothering control, convinced he suffered from asthma and various ailments that required constant medication. His placebo inhaler became security object, psychological crutch that his mother had deliberately created to maintain dependency. Eddie's actual bravery, hidden beneath anxiety his mother had cultivated, would emerge during confrontations with IT. His fear of disease and contamination provided the entity with perfect manifestation, a diseased figure that represented everything Eddie had been taught to avoid. Stanley Uris approached the world through orderly logic, his Jewish faith and bird-watching hobby providing structures that helped him understand chaos. Stan struggled with the irrational aspects of their situation, his mind seeking rational explanations even when confronted with obvious supernatural phenomena. His fear centered on things that didn't fit natural order, distortions of reality that violated fundamental principles he relied upon. The portrait in his father's office, coming alive and twisting into impossible configurations, represented Stan's worst nightmare. Ben Hanscom arrived in Derry as new kid, overweight and intellectual, immediately targeted by the town's bullies. His crush on Beverly Marsh motivated much of his early courage, though genuine bravery emerged independent of romantic feelings. Ben's research abilities proved crucial, his hours in the Derry Public Library uncovering historical patterns that others had missed. He discovered the 27-year cycle, documented previous tragedies, created timeline that revealed its nature. His fear of the headless boy and mummy that chased him from the library demonstrated how IT could weaponize historical knowledge against those who sought to understand it. Beverly Marsh lived with constant threat of violence from her abusive father, whose behavior had recently taken a disturbing turn towards sexual menace that Beverly couldn't fully articulate. This home situation made her fearless about external dangers, having already faced terrors within her own house. Beverly's encounter with blood and hair erupting from her bathroom sink represented her fears about womanhood, sexuality, and her father's predatory attention. Her toughness and loyalty made her integral to the group's cohesion, particularly as only female member navigating both childhood and adolescence while fighting cosmic evil. Mike Hanlon experienced double outsider status, being both black in predominantly white town and homeschooled by grandparents who had survived the Black Spot Fire. His grandfather's stories about the 1930 tragedy provided crucial context for understanding IT's history. Mike's fear centered on fire and the bird creature his father had described, trauma transmitted across generations. His eventual joining of the Losers Club represented the group's completion, 7 becoming a significant number with magical properties that strengthened their collective power against IT. The Bowers gang provided human threat that paralleled supernatural danger. Henry Bowers, son of abusive veteran father, channeled his own trauma into tormenting anyone weaker. Patrick Hochstetter, genuine psychopath who had killed his infant brother and maintained refrigerator full of dying animals, represented human evil approaching IT's callousness. Victor Criss and Moose Sadler followed Henry's lead, participating in escalating violence that included racial harassment of Mike, attempted murder of Ben, and sexual threats toward Beverly. The gang's cruelty demonstrated that monsters came in purely human form as well as supernatural. The Losers' individual encounters with IT revealed the entity's sophisticated psychological warfare. Bill saw Georgie's ghost in his basement, his dead brother offering forgiveness while simultaneously threatening him. Beverly's bathroom exploded with blood visible only to her, adults, including her father, seeing nothing unusual. Eddie confronted the leper on Neibolt Street, diseased figure offering sexual threat alongside physical contamination. Stan's painting came alive during his bar mitzvah preparation, distorted woman pursuing him through his father's office. Ben encountered headless victims from the Kitchener Ironworks explosion, their bodies dripping and decayed. Mike's encounter proved particularly significant, connecting present horror to historical pattern. He saw his parents burning, reliving trauma they had escaped during the Black Spot Fire. The vision included the bird creature his father had described, IT maintaining form across generations, as if demonstrating continuity to those capable of recognizing patterns. Mike's psychic abilities, inherited from his father's sensitivity, allowed him to perceive more of IT's true nature than most victims managed before being consumed. Richie's fears centered on clowns and dolls, his encounter in the Neibolt house presenting him with casket containing his own corpse as child-sized doll before Pennywise erupted from concealment. The terror of seeing himself dead, of confronting mortality in such immediate fashion, nearly broke Richie's characteristic humour. Only Bill's intervention saved him from the deadlights, pulling him physically from the room where IT had trapped him psychologically. The Neibolt house at 29 Neibolt Street became central location for the Losers' investigation and eventual confrontation. The abandoned structure, avoided by sensible residents, stood as obvious source of wrongness in the neighbourhood. Ben's research identified the house as Nexus Point, place where sewer systems connected in ways that shouldn't be possible, where IT's influence concentrated most strongly. The house's interior defied normal architecture, rooms appearing in impossible configurations, spaces larger than external dimensions allowed, floors rotting in patterns that guided visitors toward specific destinations. The group's first organised incursion into Neibolt House occurred after Ben's slideshow presentation, where IT attacked them collectively, By animating the projected images, Pennywise's head emerged from the screen, enormous and terrible, demonstrating that IT could manifest anywhere the losers gathered. Bill's impulsive response was charging toward the house alone, forcing the others to follow despite their terror. This confrontation ended badly, the group separated by IT's manipulation of space and pursued by individual manifestations of their fears. Eddie's broken arm resulted from this encounter, falling through rotted floor that IT had specifically weakened to injure him. The injury was serious enough to require hospitalization, providing the losers with cover story for their activities while forcing several-week delay in their campaign. During Eddie's recovery, the group planned more carefully, recognizing that courage alone wouldn't defeat entity that had survived centuries. They needed not just bravery, but belief, unified purpose that would allow their collective will to overcome IT's ancient power. The concept of belief as weapon emerged gradually through their discussions and research. Ben discovered references in occult texts to entities that were harmed by conviction, supernatural beings whose power derived partially from victims' fear and doubt. If IT fed on terror, then perhaps courage and certainty could starve or wound it. The losers experimented with this theory, finding that IT's manifestations weakened when confronted with direct denial of their reality or aggressive assertion that the entity could be defeated. Silver, both as Bill's bicycle and as the metal itself, gained significance through the losers' developing understanding of symbolic power. The bicycle, named Silver and ridden at reckless speeds, represented Bill's determination and forward momentum despite obstacles. The metal Silver, associated in folklore with defeating monsters, became focus for belief-based magic. Beverly's skill with the slingshot, combined with belief that Silver could harm IT, led to creation of Silver Slug from melted coin. This projectile, charged with the losers' collective faith in its effectiveness, would prove crucial in their final confrontation. The climactic battle occurred in late August 1958, when the losers descended into Derry's sewers to confront IT in its lair. The journey through underground passages exposed them to the full extent of IT's realm, tunnels that existed outside normal space, chambers that predated human construction, and finally, the cistern where IT dwelt. The entity appeared initially as Pennywise, using familiar form to mock their presumption in challenging it. The clown's confidence was justified by centuries of successful hunting, no previous group having mounted effective resistance. The confrontation escalated as IT revealed forms beyond the clown, spider-like configuration that represented closest approximation to its true nature that human minds could process. The losers attacked with improvised weapons, symbolic items charged with belief, and more importantly, with unified determination that IT couldn't fully comprehend. The entity understood fear, but struggled with courage, particularly collective bravery that allowed individuals to overcome personal terror for sake of friends. This incomprehension created vulnerability that the losers exploited. Beverly's shot with the Silver Slug struck IT directly, penetrating the entity's form and causing genuine injury. The deadlights blazed from the wound IT's true essence exposed briefly before. The creature retreated into deeper darkness. The losers pressed their advantage, pursuing IT through collapsing tunnels, maintaining belief even as exhaustion and terror threatened to break their unity. Bill's internal confrontation occurred on psychic level, his consciousness brushing against the macroverse and IT's true nature before pulling back to rejoin his friends in physical realm. Its retreat indicated defeat, but not destruction. The entity withdrew to recover, wounded and confused by children who had somehow overcome advantages that had guaranteed victory for millennia. The losers emerged from the sewers triumphant, but aware their victory was incomplete. It lived still, dormant but not dead, waiting for time when the children would forget their courage and become vulnerable again. This knowledge prompted the blood oath, solemn vow that if Ait returned, they would return as well to finish what they'd started. The oath ceremony occurred at the Barrens, their childhood sanctuary, each loser cutting their palm and joining hands to mingle blood. The physical act carried genuine magical weight, creating bond that transcended normal friendship. They swore to remember, to return, to confront IT again if necessary. Even as they spoke the words, they felt the forgetting beginning, Ait's influence ensuring that memory would fade. The oath would survive as subconscious compulsion when the time came, buried knowledge that would draw them home decades later. The aftermath saw the losers gradually drifting toward normal childhood, their memories of the summer already becoming dreamlike. Parents noticed changes in their children, new confidence, closer friendships, but attributed these to natural maturation. Eddie's arm healed, Ben's weight began dropping through natural growth. Beverly found courage to resist her father more effectively. Bill's stutter improved slightly, though guilt about Georgie would never fully resolve. The group remained close through remaining school years, but the intensity of their shared experience faded as IT's influence encouraged forgetting. The children's victory demonstrated truths it feared, that courage multiplied through friendship, that belief could wound ancient evil, that innocence possessed power darkness couldn't comprehend. 7 children, armed with improvised weapons and pure determination, had accomplished what centuries of adults had failed to achieve. They had hurt IT, forced it into hiding, proven that the entity was not invincible despite its cosmic origins and accumulated power. This knowledge, even forgotten, would resonate when the time came for their return. 27 years passed, the losers scattered across the country, memories fading until only Mike Hanlon remained vigilant in Derry, watching for signs that ancient evil had returned. The intervening decades transformed the children into adults, pursuing separate lives, each achieving varying degrees of success and happiness while subconsciously avoiding thoughts of their hometown. Bill Denbrough became a successful horror novelist, his books exploring fears he couldn't consciously remember confronting. Beverly Marsh built a career in fashion design, escaping her abusive father only to marry a man who replicated that dynamic. Ben Hanscom transformed himself physically while becoming a wealthy architect, losing weight and gaining confidence, yet remaining somehow incomplete. Richie Tozier achieved fame as stand-up comedian and radio personality, using humor professionally as he had defensively in childhood. Eddie Kasprak ran limousine service in New York, married to a woman remarkably similar to his domineering mother. Stanley Uris became accountant in Atlanta, building orderly life that his childhood experiences had taught him to value. Mike alone maintained connection to Derry, working as town librarian, position that provided access to historical records and opportunity for continued research. Where his friends forgot, Mike remembered fragments, enough to recognize patterns when they emerged. His solitary vigil, lasting nearly 3 decades, took psychological toll. He lived suspended between past trauma and anticipated future horror, unable to move forward while friends built lives elsewhere. His dedication to monitoring Derry's supernatural pulse isolated him socially, romantically, professionally, sacrificing personal happiness to serve as guardian against threat others couldn't remember. The summer of 1984 announced its return through hate crime that awakened dormant hunger. Adrian Mellon and Don Haggerty, gay couple visiting Derry for county fair, encountered 3 local youths whose homophobia required minimal supernatural influence to express itself violently. Christopher Unwin, Webby Garton, and John Moose Sadler attacked the couple near the canal bridge, beating them while shouting slurs. The assault escalated when they threw Mellon from the bridge into the water below, his partner watching helplessly as his beloved fell. Pennywise emerged from beneath the bridge where Ait had been waiting, drawn by violence and terror that marked the entity's reawakening. The clown seized Mellon in full view of witnesses, including Haggerty, dragging the injured man into shadows beneath the bridge. Mellon's screams lasted only moments before silence fell. Police investigation recovered his body days later, wounds attributed to the fall and subsequent drowning, despite evidence suggesting additional trauma. The 3 attackers received relatively light sentences for assault, the full scope of their actions deliberately minimized by authorities uncomfortable with case's implications. Mike recognized the pattern immediately. The hate crime, occurring precisely 27 years after Georgie's death, combined with other recent disappearances he'd been tracking, confirmed that IT had returned. His research had prepared him for this moment, though knowing what must happen didn't ease the burden. Mike had to make phone calls he'd dreaded for decades, summoning friends home to fulfill oaths they couldn't consciously remember. The prospect of dragging them back into nightmare filled him with guilt, but allowing IT to continue hunting uncontested would doom generations of children. The phone calls began on a June evening when Mike could delay no longer. 9 children had disappeared or died in circumstances suggesting IT's involvement, matching the body count that had prompted the losers to act in 1958. Each call followed similar pattern, Mike identifying himself, asking if the person remembered Derry, watching their confusion transform into dawning horror as buried memories surfaced partially. The conversations were brief, Mike explaining only that IT had returned and they'd promised to come back. Most agreed immediately, despite not fully understanding why, oath's compulsion overriding rational objections. Bill Denbrough received his call while in England with his wife Audra, actress who had no knowledge of her husband's hidden past. The conversation with Mike triggered fragmentary memories, images of sewers and clowns that Bill couldn't quite integrate into coherent narrative. He told Audra he needed to return to America for urgent business, unable to explain further because the memories wouldn't solidify enough for articulation. His nightmares intensified immediately, his subconscious accessing what his conscious mind still blocked. Beverly Marsh reached at her Chicago apartment, experienced flood of returning memory during the call itself. She remembered friends, adventures, terror, and most significantly, the courage they'd found together. Her abusive husband Tom, sensing her attention shifting away from him, attempted to prevent her departure through intimidation and violence. Beverly's resistance, empowered by rekindled memory of who she'd been before Tom's conditioning, allowed her to escape. She fled to Derry, carrying only essentials, leaving behind marriage that had been slow death. Ben Hanscom, contacted at his Nebraska office, struggled initially to place Mike or Derry in his memory. The conversation pierced fog that had obscured decades, bringing back not just events but emotions, particularly his feelings for Beverly that had never fully resolved. His successful architecture career suddenly felt hollow, achievements measured against unfinished business in Derry. Ben arranged immediate travel despite pressing professional obligations, oath taking precedence over everything he'd built in the interim. Richie Tozier's response combined characteristic humour with underlying terror he couldn't quite identify. Speaking to Mike triggered anxiety attack, Richie's body remembering what his mind wouldn't. His radio show suffered immediately, his timing off, his voices failing him as psychic disturbance interfered with professional tools he'd perfected. Richie booked flight to Maine, despite not understanding why, trusting instinct over logic in ways his rational adult self would normally reject. Eddie Kasprek received the call at his office, Mike's voice catalyzing panic attack that required Eddie's ever-present medications to control. His wife Myra, even more controlling than his mother had been, objected strenuously to his announced departure. Eddie's insistence, fueled by oath's compulsion, led to marital crisis he'd been avoiding for years. He departed despite Myra's threats and tears, recognizing at some level that this journey mattered more than anything in his adult life. Stanley Uris's call ended differently. The conversation with Mike triggered complete memory restoration. Stan suddenly remembering everything they'd faced, everything it could do, everything they'd barely survived as children, with imagination and courage that adults no longer possessed. The memories overwhelmed Stan's carefully constructed psychological defenses, his orderly worldview collapsing under weight of cosmic horror's reality. Rather than return to Derry and face IT again, Stan chose a bath, a razor, and message written in his own blood before consciousness departed. His wife discovered him hours later, too late for intervention. The bathroom a scene of tragedy that left only cryptic words scrawled on the tile. It. Stan's death devastated the returning losers when Mike informed them. Their first casualty had fallen before they'd even reunited, IT claiming victim through fear alone, demonstrating that the entity's power extended beyond Derry's boundaries to anyone who fully remembered. Stan's suicide also confirmed terrible truth. They weren't children anymore. Their adult minds lacked the flexibility and belief that had enabled victory 27 years earlier. This disadvantage terrified them, each recognizing privately that Stan might have made the rational choice. The reunion occurred at Chinese restaurant in downtown Derry, awkward gathering of near strangers who had once been closest friends. They recognized each other physically, despite decades of change, but emotional connection took time to re-establish. Bill's marriage to Audra, whom he'd brought despite misgivings, added complication. Ben's dramatic physical transformation shocked Beverly, who struggled to reconcile the handsome man before her with the overweight boy she'd loved. Richie's defensive humour intensified. Eddie's anxiety manifested through multiple medications, and Mike's isolation showed in his difficulty engaging with social dynamics. The fortune cookie attack interrupted their tentative catching up, IT demonstrating its awareness of their gathering. The cookies contained not fortunes but terrible things, living creatures, hostile messages, manifestations of personal fears that erupted onto the table. The restaurant staff and other patrons saw nothing unusual, IT's influence localizing the attack to target only the losers. The incident served multiple purposes, reminding them of IT's power, shattering any illusion that this would be easier than their childhood battle, and forcing immediate acknowledgement that they were in danger simply by being in Derry. Mike revealed his research into methods for permanently destroying IT, having spent decades seeking solutions the children hadn't known existed. His quest had led him to remnants of the Shakapiwa tribe, descendants who maintained fragments of traditional knowledge. From them, Mike learned of the ritual of Chud, psychic battle of wills conducted on the Macroverse's threshold, the indigenous people's method for containing IT that they believed could be adapted for destruction. The ritual required specific components, personal artifacts connecting each participant to their childhood confrontation, tokens charged with memory and meaning. The losers dispersed across Derry to retrieve these artifacts, each journey forcing confrontation with past and present. Bill returned to his childhood home, finding it occupied by a different family, but unchanged in essential architecture. In the basement where he'd built boats with Georgie, he recovered silver dollar he'd been saving, talisman connecting him to his dead brother and the guilt that still haunted him. Beverly returned to her old apartment building, finding the bathroom where blood and hair had erupted from the drain. Her token was a postcard from Ben, winter fire message she'd kept hidden from her father, representing safety and hope during terrible time. Ben's search took him to the library where he'd discovered Derry's hidden history and first glimpsed its true nature. His artifact was the yearbook page Beverly had signed, only signature he'd received that year, proof that someone had seen him when he felt invisible. Eddie confronted the Neibolt house, that structure of nightmare, retrieving inhaler he'd lost during their first disastrous incursion. physical manifestation of both his weakness and the courage he'd found despite it. Richie's token came from the arcade where he'd spent countless hours, token from a game he'd been playing when Bill had first approached him about fighting IT, symbol of childhood interrupted by necessity. Mike's artifact was the rock with which he'd fought Henry Bowers at the Barrens, weapon in his hand when the other losers had arrived to save him, moment that transformed isolated outsider into member of beloved community. These objects, seemingly mundane, carried psychic weight accumulated through decades of subconscious significance. Charged with memory, emotion, and meaning, they would serve as anchors during the ritual of Chud, connecting present adults to childhood selves who had possessed courage they now struggled to access. Henry Bowers' return complicated their situation dramatically. It had released Henry from the psychiatric facility where he'd been confined since his father's death, providing him with purpose and means to pursue the losers. Henry's sanity, already fragile, had deteriorated completely during his confinement, making him perfect instrument for IT's purposes. His arrival at the hotel where the losers were staying, armed with knife and filled with murderous intent, represented collision of past and present traumas. Eddie's confrontation with Henry ended accidentally. The knife meant for Eddie instead, plunging into Henry during the struggle, killing him instantly. Henry's death marked a transition from preparation to action. The losers descended into Derry's sewers through the Neibolt house, retracing paths they'd travelled as children, but now seeing them with adult eyes that perceived more of the wrongness. The tunnel seemed worse than remembered, deeper, more extensive, architectural impossibilities that shouldn't exist, even in supernatural context. They found Audra, Bill's wife, whom IT had kidnapped and suspended in catatonic state within the cistern, her consciousness trapped in the deadlights, while her body hung like trophy. The ritual of Chud commenced with Mike's guidance, the losers arranging themselves around the artifact Mike had stolen or been given, accounts varying from the Shokopiwa descendants. They placed their tokens within the vessel, lighting fire that consumed the objects while chanting phrases Mike had learned. The ritual seemed to work initially, the deadlights appearing and being drawn into the container, IT's essence apparently trapped by the ceremony's power. The losers allowed themselves momentary hope, believing that centuries-old knowledge would succeed where childhood improvisation had merely wounded. Its laughter shattered that hope. The deadlights exploded from the container, growing into an enormous balloon before transforming into the entity's final form. Pennywise emerged combined with the spider configuration, massive hybrid that filled the cistern, its clawed legs skittering across stone, its clown face grinning with malicious triumph. Mike confessed then that he'd lied. The ritual had failed for the indigenous people, all participants slaughtered by IT immediately after attempting it. He'd believed that their greater connection to IT, their history of having hurt it once, might change the outcome. His desperate gambit had failed, leaving them facing angry entity without the psychological advantages children had possessed. It separated the losers, trapping each in personalized nightmare designed to exploit adult fears that differed from childhood terrors. Bill confronted his failure to save Georgie. Beverly faced her abusive father and husband simultaneously. Ben battled his continued inadequacy. Richie struggled with loneliness he'd masked with humor. Eddie fought contamination and weakness. Mike faced his guilt over the lies he'd told to bring them here. The entity's strategy was to break them individually before killing them collectively. Psychological torture preceding physical destruction. Beverly's voice cut through the isolation, calling to the others, reminding them of connection that IT couldn't fully understand. The losers forced themselves toward each other's voices, despite IT's manipulation of space, reuniting through determination that mirrored childhood courage. Together, they began adapting the failed ritual, abandoning indigenous methodology in favour of truth they'd learned decades earlier. It could be hurt by belief, by courage, by refusing to accept its power as absolute. The way to defeat ancient evil wasn't through borrowed ceremony, but through unified will that Ait's solitary nature couldn't comprehend. Richie became trapped in the deadlights during this confrontation, his consciousness beginning the terrible journey toward It's true form that meant permanent loss. Eddie, seeing his friend in danger, grabbed the fence post Beverly had given him earlier, artifact from the Neibolt house, charged with their collective belief that it could harm It. He attacked the spider-clown hybrid, driving the improvised spear into its body with strength born of desperation and love for his friend. The blow connected, It releasing Richie from the deadlight's pull while screaming in genuine pain. Its counterattack came instantly. One of the spider legs, tipped with spike, stabbed through Eddie's chest, lifting him from the ground and shaking him like discarded toy. The injury was massive, Eddie's torso pierced completely, blood loss immediate and catastrophic. It threw Eddie's body aside, dismissing him as inconsequential, but the damage was done on both sides. Eddie was dying, and It was wounded badly enough to be vulnerable. The remaining losers gathered around Eddie as his life drained away, his final moments spent urging them to finish what he'd started. Eddie's death galvanized the survivors into focused rage. They attacked It with everything available: physical weapons, psychic assault, and most importantly with mockery and diminishment. They shouted that It was not ancient evil, but cowardly child killer. Not cosmic entity, but pathetic parasite. Not invincible force, but wounded animal cornered and afraid. This verbal assault, combined with their unified belief that It could be defeated, forced the entity to shrink, its form becoming smaller as their conviction grew stronger. The losers realized they could impose reality on It, their collective will stronger than the entity's individual power. The final destruction required them to make It feel small, reducing cosmic horror to manageable threat through pure belief. As they advanced, still calling insults and assertions of It's weakness, the entity continued shrinking, its hybrid form diminishing until it became something they could physically attack. Bill reached into the mass that had been It's heart, pulling the organ from the body while Ben crushed the eggs It had laid throughout the cistern. The death was neither clean nor certain, It dissolving into components that suggested it might reconstitute given time, but the damage seemed sufficient for permanent destruction. Derry itself began collapsing as It died, the entity having been so thoroughly integrated into the town structure that its destruction destabilized reality. Buildings crumbled, streets split open, the downtown area falling into sinkholes that appeared without warning. The losers escaped through collapsing sewers, carrying Eddie's body initially before being forced to leave it behind when pursuing collapse threatened to trap them all. Bill retrieved Audra from her catatonic state, carrying his wife through the destruction while she remained unresponsive, mind still trapped somewhere the deadlights had taken it. The survivors emerged into chaos, Derry destroying itself around them. They fled in Bill's rental car, driving through streets that were falling apart, buildings collapsing in their wake. The destruction seemed selective, sparing the fleeing losers while consuming the town that had enabled It's existence. Behind them, downtown Derry collapsed completely, centuries of accumulated evil vanishing into craters that suggested the ground itself rejected what had been built there. The entity's death meant the end of the town as they'd known it, though residential areas survived and would allow Derry to continue in diminished form. At the hospital where Audra received treatment for her catatonia, the surviving losers said their goodbyes, knowing that forgetting would claim them again. They could already feel memories beginning to slip, details becoming hazy, the sharp clarity of recent events fading into dreamlike quality. They embraced, promised to stay in touch, knowing they probably wouldn't, and departed Derry separately. Bill remained with Audra, hoping that love and patience might restore what Ite had taken from her consciousness. The others returned to their lives, carrying wounds both physical and psychological that would heal imperfectly. The forgetting occurred more rapidly than any expected. Within days, the losers struggled to remember why they'd been in Maine, what had happened there, even who had been with them. Eddie's death existed as vague awareness of loss, without clear memory of friend or circumstances. This amnesia, while painful, provided mercy as well, allowing them to function without constant awareness of cosmic horror and personal tragedy. They resumed their lives changed, but unable to articulate how, improved in subtle ways that therapy couldn't explain because they couldn't remember the trauma they'd overcome. The adult losers achieved what centuries of attempts could not, Ite's complete destruction through combined strength, though the price demanded one life and all memory of their shared heroism. They had proven that even diminished adult courage, when multiplied through friendship and sharpened by sacrifice, could destroy evil that had seemed eternal. Their victory would be forgotten by everyone, including themselves, but Derry's children would grow up safer, for battles fought in sewers, beneath their streets. Structural damage from IT's death manifested immediately, portions of downtown Derry collapsing into sinkholes that suggested the entity's physical presence had been supporting impossible architecture. The ground itself seemed to reject what had been built above it, century-old buildings falling into caverns that shouldn't exist according to geological surveys. The canal system, always prone to flooding, experienced catastrophic failures, as underground passages IT had created collapsed or sealed themselves. City engineers confronted infrastructure problems that defied rational explanation, pipes and tunnels appearing on no official plans, spaces existing where solid bedrock should have been. The immediate response focused on practical concerns rather than supernatural implications. Emergency services evacuated endangered areas. Construction crews attempted to stabilize compromised structures. City officials declared states of emergency that would extend for months. Insurance companies disputed coverage for damage. They categorized as acts of God, though which God remained carefully unspecified. The reconstruction costs exceeded Derry's budget by substantial margins, requiring state and federal assistance that came with bureaucratic oversight and uncomfortable questions about how such extensive infrastructure failure could occur simultaneously. Population exodus began almost immediately. Families who had lived in Derry for generations decided suddenly that opportunities existed elsewhere, that children would thrive better in different environments, that staying in the town carried risks they couldn't articulate but deeply felt. The departures weren't panicked flight, but steady drainage, moving trucks arriving with increasing frequency to transport belongings and memories to new locations. Within 5 years, Derry's population declined by nearly 30%. Businesses closed for lack of customers. Schools consolidated as student numbers dropped. The economic decline followed predictable patterns once population decrease crossed critical thresholds. Manufacturing facilities already struggling with national economic changes closed permanently rather than investing in repairs to damaged infrastructure. Retail establishments that depended on local consumer base found insufficient customers to justify continuing operations. Professional services, medical practices, law firms, accounting offices relocated to more prosperous communities. The town entered death spiral, where each closure encouraged additional departures, which prompted more closures. Curiously, certain aspects of Derry improved despite overall decline. Crime rates, historically elevated compared to similar-sized communities, normalized to match state averages. Domestic violence reports decreased significantly, though whether this reflected actual reduction or simply fewer people remained unclear. Most notably, child disappearances and unexplained deaths ceased completely. The statistical anomaly that had marked Derry's history, periodic spikes in missing children, occurring with 27-year regularity, simply ended. Parents who studied local crime statistics for school reports found themselves confused by the sudden change, unable to explain why their town had become measurably safer for children, just as it was dying economically. The psychological atmosphere transformed in ways residents noticed without understanding. Long-time inhabitants described feeling as if pressure they'd never consciously perceived had suddenly lifted. People reported sleeping better, experiencing fewer nightmares, feeling generally more optimistic despite economic hardship. Therapists in surrounding communities saw influx of Derry residents seeking treatment for depression and anxiety that seemed to ease once they'd relocated, as if distance from the town provided relief from burden they couldn't name. Older residents experienced particular confusion regarding their memories. Many found themselves unable to recall specific events they knew must have occurred, gaps in personal and collective history that frustrated attempts at reminiscence. The phenomenon extended beyond normal age-related memory loss, encompassing decades of selective amnesia that seemed to affect entire community. Historical Society members attempting to compile comprehensive town history encountered frustrating contradictions in records, witness testimonies that didn't align, documented events that no living person remembered clearly. Some fragments of awareness persisted despite general forgetting. Certain locations retained reputations as places to avoid, though reasons remained vague. The old ironworks site, though redeveloped decades earlier, still made people uncomfortable without clear justification. The Neibolt Street neighbourhood attracted no new residents, despite affordable housing, buildings standing empty because potential buyers experienced inexplicable reluctance. The Barrens, unofficial playground for generations of children, attracted fewer young people, parents steering offspring toward official parks without articulating their unease. Mike Hanlon continued his work as town librarian throughout this period, maintaining his unique position as someone who remembered fragments of truth others had forgotten. His research materials, accumulated over decades, documented patterns that official histories ignored or minimized. Mike's presence provided continuity, his institutional knowledge preserving information that might otherwise disappear completely. However, even Mike found his memories becoming dreamlike, sharp details fading into impressions, certainty becoming possibility. The library itself became repository for Derry's suppressed history. Mike organised special collection, accessing requiring researcher credentials, containing materials about the town's tragedies. News archives documenting the Kitchener Ironworks explosion, the Bradley Gang massacre, the Black Spot fire, and numerous smaller incidents were preserved alongside Mike's personal notes and theories. Future historians studying Derry would find these materials invaluable, though most would dismiss Mike's supernatural conclusions as colourful local folklore rather than literal truth. The physical scars from 1985's destruction remained visible for years. Downtown never fully recovered, several blocks permanently closed to development after being condemned as structurally unsound. The crater where Main Street had collapsed became Small Park, landscaping disguising the fact that ground beneath remained unstable. Plaques commemorating businesses and buildings that had occupied the destroyed areas served as memorials to Derry's more prosperous past, though they carefully avoided explaining what had caused the destruction. The question of whether Derry was better off without IT troubled those few who had sufficient memory to consider it. The town was dying, certainly, population and economy both declining toward eventual ghost town status. Yet children were safe in ways they'd never been historically. The pervasive sense of wrongness that had characterized Derry's atmosphere had disappeared. People who remained reported greater happiness despite reduced circumstances. The trade seemed brutal, but potentially justified. The town's slow death purchasing genuine safety for its children. No return of evil occurred as years passed. The 27-year cycle regular as clockwork for centuries, simply ended. 2012 arrived without incident, the date passing unmarked by residents who'd forgotten the pattern ever existed. Researchers studying cyclical violence in small communities noted Derry's case as an interesting anomaly, attempting to explain the sudden cessation through sociological theories that couldn't quite account for the complete transformation. Their papers, published in obscure academic journals, came closest to acknowledging supernatural elements while maintaining scholarly respectability by framing conclusions in carefully agnostic language. Economic development attempts met with consistent failure. State programs designed to revitalise struggling communities found Derry resistant to improvement in ways that frustrated planners. Tax incentives failed to attract new businesses. Infrastructure improvements seemed wasted when population continued declining. Marketing campaigns emphasising the town's history and natural beauty generated minimal interest. The community seemed to have reached terminal stage, slow fade toward abandonment appearing inevitable, yet Derry persisted. The population stabilised at roughly 40% of its peak, creating smaller but functioning community. Those who remained developed strong bonds, shared investment in the town's survival, creating cohesion that had been absent during prosperous periods. The remaining businesses adapted to reduced customer base. Local government streamlined operations to match available tax revenue. Community organisations filled gaps that commercial enterprises had previously occupied. Derry survived as a diminished version of itself, smaller and poorer but also safer and arguably healthier. The collective amnesia regarding IT lifted partially for some individuals. Occasional residents experienced fragmentary memories, dreams that felt more like recollections, inexplicable knowledge about events they shouldn't remember. These people, dismissed as eccentric or suffering from false memories, preserved threads of truth through personal narratives that others rejected as fantasy. Their stories, shared quietly in bars or at family gatherings, maintained oral tradition parallel to official history, alternative narrative that contained more accuracy than anyone acknowledged. Former losers occasionally dreamed of Derry despite forgetting why the town mattered to them. Bill would wake with impression of paper boats and storm drains. Beverly would experience anxiety about bathrooms and drains without understanding its source. Ben would feel nostalgic for library he couldn't quite picture clearly. These dreams, troubling but fragmentary, didn't restore full memory, but suggested that complete forgetting remained impossible. The experiences they'd shared, even when consciousness released them, had carved channels in their psyches that channeled sleeping thoughts toward Derry. Children growing up in post-IT, Derry experienced town fundamentally different from what previous generations had known. Their childhoods, while marked by economic hardship and declining community resources, lacked the supernatural dread that had characterized earlier eras. They played without fear, explored without encountering ancient evil, grew up without nightmares that reflected genuine threats. This generation, the first to mature free from IT's influence, showed measurably better psychological outcomes, fewer trauma indicators, greater life satisfaction. The town's curse had lifted completely from those too young to remember its presence. The environmental recovery followed the psychological healing. Areas that had seemed perpetually blighted, where vegetation struggled and wildlife avoided, gradually normalised. The barrens, while still avoided by many, showed ecological improvement as native plants returned and animal populations rebounded. The Kenduskeag stream, historically polluted and somehow wrong beyond mere chemical contamination, ran clearer, fish returning to waters that had been essentially dead for decades. These changes, documented by environmental groups studying ecological recovery, defied straightforward explanation, but were welcomed nonetheless. Mike Hanlon's eventual retirement from the library marked end of an era. His replacement, younger librarian unconnected to Derry's hidden history, approached the position without Mike's obsessive vigilance. The special collection remained, carefully catalogued and preserved, but lost its active curator who understood its true significance. Mike himself moved to Florida, joining the general exodus from Derry, taking with him personal knowledge that no archive could fully capture. His departure represented final severing of conscious connection to the truth. The town's transformation from cursed ground to ordinary struggling community demonstrated both evil's profound impact and its ultimate impermanence. Derry had been shaped by IT's presence across centuries, the entity's influence affecting architecture, population, psychology, even geology. Yet within years of IT's destruction, the supernatural influence evaporated, leaving mundane problems of economic decline and demographic change. The curse's lifting proved that even centuries of corruption could be reversed, though the cost in terms of community vitality was substantial. Derry survived IT's destruction to face perhaps greater challenge, discovering who they were without darkness defining them. The town's identity had been shaped by its tragedies, its cyclical horrors, providing perverse distinction that set it apart from similar communities. Without that dark fame, Derry became generic struggling industrial town, facing same challenges as dozens of similar communities, but lacking the supernatural element that had made it remarkable. The choice between cursed prosperity and blessed decline carried no obvious answer. Understanding the creature called IT requires accepting that some evils exist beyond human categories, ancient and alien, yet intimately connected to human consciousness. The entity defied simple classification, operating simultaneously as physical predator, psychic parasite, and cosmic force. Attempts to analyze IT through scientific framework inevitably failed, the creature's nature transcending materialist explanations while remaining devastatingly real in its impacts. The closest taxonomic designation, drawn from esoteric traditions rather than mainstream science, classified IT as glamour, shape-shifting entity whose existence predated human civilization. The deadlights represented its truest form, essence underlying all manifestations. These appeared as clusters of orange lights, pulsing with malevolent intelligence, visible only when IT chose to reveal them or when victims gazed too deeply into the entity's core. The deadlights existed partially outside normal space-time, residing in the macroverse while projecting into mundane reality. Those who saw them directly experienced immediate psychological devastation, consciousness overwhelmed by cosmic horror beyond human processing capacity. Victims entered catatonic states, minds trapped between dimensions, while bodies remained suspended in living death. Human perception proved fundamentally inadequate for comprehending IT's actual form. The brain, confronted with entity from outside known reality, translated the incomprehensible into something manageable, a spider being the closest approximation most minds could construct. This translation occurred automatically, protective mechanism preventing complete psychological collapse. However, the spider image remained interpretation rather than reality, comfortable lie the mind told itself to avoid confronting truth that would shatter sanity completely. The entity's classification as glamour indicated membership in cosmic category of shape-shifting beings billions of years old. These creatures possess no fixed physical form, existing as consciousness capable of manifesting in whatever configuration served their purposes. The glamours fed on emotions rather than conventional matter, making them psychic vampires dependent on conscious beings for sustenance. It represented particularly powerful and malevolent example of this species, though whether others existed on Earth remained unknown. Shape-shifting mechanics operated through telepathic scanning and physical materialization. It read minds constantly when active, perceiving thoughts, memories, fears with casual ease. This surveillance required no conscious effort, the entity simply perceiving mental activity the way humans perceived light or sound. Once it identified useful fear, it manifested as that terror, transforming its physical form to match the victim's nightmare. This process occurred nearly instantaneously, IT shifting between manifestations with fluid grace that suggested the forms were costumes rather than transformations. The preference for Pennywise the dancing clown reflected calculated psychology rather than arbitrary choice. Clowns occupied unique position in human consciousness, simultaneously beloved and feared, familiar yet uncanny. Children, ites preferred prey, generally responded to clowns with either delight or terror, both reactions serving the entity's purposes. A delighted child could be lured easily, while a terrified child provided immediate nourishment. Additionally, Pennywise's theatrical nature allowed IT to engage in elaborate psychological games, prolonging terror for enhanced flavor. The choice of the name Pennywise demonstrated its understanding of human culture. The entity had observed performers, perhaps in the 1800s, and recognized the effectiveness of clown persona for predation. The specific costume, with its ruffled collar, orange pom-poms, and exaggerated features, combined classic circus aesthetics with subtle wrongness that triggered instinctive unease. The effect was creature that looked almost human, almost safe, but contained unmistakable menace beneath cheerful surface. It occasionally used the alias Robert Gray, name drawn from multiple possible sources. The connection to child cannibal Albert Fish, who reportedly used Robert Gray as alias, suggested its awareness of and possible identification with human monsters. Alternatively, the name might reference Robert Bob Bell, original Bozo the Clown performer, indicating its study of entertainment figures it mimicked. The entity's willingness to provide name at all demonstrated confidence, bordering on arrogance, IT secure enough in its power to engage in social pleasantries even while stalking victims. Feeding requirements shaped IT's entire existence and methodology. The entity needed to consume human beings, preferably children, to sustain itself across centuries. However, simple physical consumption provided minimal nourishment. It discovered early that fear fundamentally altered prey's taste and nutritional value, terror acting as seasoning that made ordinary flesh extraordinarily satisfying. This discovery led to the entity's signature approach, extended stalking that built terror to crescendo before final consumption. The phrase salting the meat precisely described this process. Children became preferred prey for multiple interconnected reasons. Their fears operated at primal level, pure and uncomplicated by adult rationalization. A child afraid of monsters believed in them completely. Conviction that empowered IT's manifestations. Adult fears, by contrast, tended toward abstract concerns, financial anxiety, relationship troubles, existential dread that didn't translate effectively into physical manifestations. Furthermore, children possessed less developed psychological defenses, their courage not yet fully formed, their understanding of mortality incomplete. This vulnerability made them easier prey, whose terror could be manipulated with relatively little effort. The entity's feeding process followed specific pattern. Initial contact established IT's presence, often through seemingly innocent interaction. Pennywise would engage children in conversation, demonstrating friendliness, offering treats or entertainment. This approach lowered defenses, making victims receptive to further contact. Subsequent encounters escalated fear gradually, IT appearing in increasingly threatening contexts, demonstrating supernatural abilities, manifesting as personalized nightmares. The prolonged terror, building across weeks or months, seasoned the prey perfectly. The final consumption combined physical and psychic feeding. It devoured victims' bodies, certainly, teeth and claws designed for efficient predation. However, the entity simultaneously consumed their consciousness, draining life force and terror accumulated during the stalking period. This dual feeding explained why victims' bodies often appeared partially consumed or missing entirely, the physical matter being less important than the psychic energy IT actually required. The deadlights played a crucial role in this process, drawing victims' consciousness into the macroverse, where it could be fully absorbed. The 27 to 30-year cycle emerged from biological necessity rather than arbitrary choice, feeding frenzies while satisfying exhausted IT despite the enormous energy gained. The entity required decades to digest both physical and psychic nourishment, hibernation allowing complete processing of consumed material. The specific interval, remarkably consistent across centuries, suggested internal clock or metabolic requirement that governed IT's activity patterns. Variations in the cycle's exact length indicated some flexibility, perhaps influenced by external factors or the volume of feeding during active periods. Awakening could be triggered prematurely through extreme violence occurring near IT's location. The entity remained somewhat aware even during hibernation, able to sense intense emotional disturbances. Acts of murder, particularly when involving children or occurring with exceptional cruelty, sometimes roused IT from dormancy. This premature awakening didn't necessarily lead to full feeding cycle, IT sometimes consuming only the individuals involved in triggering violence before returning to sleep. The 1851 Marxan familicide likely represented such partial awakening rather than complete cycle initiation. Territorial limitations significantly constrained IT's hunting range. The entity remained bound to the impact site where it had crashed millions of years earlier, unable to venture far from that location permanently. The star fragments that had brought IT to Earth possessed properties that created barriers the creature couldn't cross. Indigenous peoples' strategic placement of these fragments had established perimeter that constrained IT's movements, while the entity could project influence beyond these boundaries, manifesting temporarily at greater distances. Its physical presence remained tied to Derry and immediate surroundings. This territorial binding explained IT's patient accumulation of human settlement at the impact site. The entity needed prey to come to it, unable to pursue victims across great distances. The corruption IT spread through the land served dual purposes, maintaining the entity's connection to physical location while subtly attracting human habitation. People felt drawn to Derry despite its documented dangers, compulsion operating beneath conscious awareness. Those who did leave often experienced relief proportional to their distance from the town, physical removal breaking IT's subtle influence over their psychology. The entity's powers extended far beyond simple shape-shifting. Telepathy allowed IT to read surface thoughts and probe deeper memories, understanding victims with disturbing completeness. The creature could influence human behavior through subtle psychic suggestion, encouraging violence, fostering denial, maintaining the collective amnesia that prevented effective resistance. Reality warping, while limited in scope, allowed IT to alter physical space within its territory, creating impossible architecture, manipulating probability, ensuring that help arrived too late or not at all. Memory manipulation represented perhaps IT's most insidious ability. The entity could encourage forgetting on individual and collective scales, ensuring that each generation arrived unprepared for dangers their predecessors had faced. This ability operated passively, victims naturally avoiding thoughts about IT even when consciously trying to remember. More actively, IT could erase specific memories, though this required direct contact and couldn't be maintained indefinitely against determined resistance. The result was Derry's characteristic amnesia pattern, where residents forgot tragedies shortly after experiencing them. The deadlights functioned as trap, weapon, and feeding mechanism simultaneously. Their appearance induced immediate psychological vulnerability, victims' defenses crumbling as they gazed into cosmic infinity. The lights drew consciousness toward the macroverse, pulling victims out of their bodies while leaving physical forms suspended. This separation allowed IT to consume the psychic essence that provided actual nourishment, while discarding or later consuming the flesh. Those rescued from the deadlights before complete absorption occurred sometimes recovered physically, while remaining psychologically devastated, their brief glimpse of cosmic truth fracturing their sense of reality permanently. Possession capabilities remained limited but functional for IT's purposes. The entity could influence humans toward violence or other behaviors serving its interests. Complete possession, where IT controlled a human body directly, appeared possible but rarely used, the energy expenditure perhaps exceeding the tactical benefit. The marks and familicides suggested influence strong enough to drive murder-suicide, while IT's participation in the Bradley Gang massacre indicated ability to stand among humans unrecognized, though whether this represented possession, illusion, or simply confident presence in a disguise remained unclear. Weaknesses existed despite IT's tremendous power. Courage, particularly collective bravery, where individuals supported each other, genuinely harmed the entity. This wasn't merely psychological resistance, but apparently physical effect, courage somehow counteracting the fear-based energy IT required. Love and friendship created barriers IT struggled to penetrate, bonds between individuals generating protective effect the entity couldn't easily overcome. The losers' unity, their willingness to face terror for each other's sake, provided literal shield that IT's attacks couldn't fully breach. Belief operated as weapon against IT in ways the entity couldn't counter effectively. When victims truly believed they could harm or defeat the ancient evil, that conviction translated into actual power. Beverly's silver slug, charged with collective faith in its effectiveness, caused genuine injury despite being ordinary metal that shouldn't have affected cosmic entity. Eddie's fence post, meaningful only because the losers believed it meaningful, damaged IT significantly. This vulnerability to belief suggested that IT's power derived partially from victims' conviction in its invincibility, psychic feedback loop where fear empowered while courage weakened. Physical vulnerability, when manifested, represented calculated risk, IT accepted for hunting purposes. The entity could remain safely in the macroverse, feeding on fear from distance, but chose to materialize physically for maximum impact. This decision left IT exposed to physical attack, particularly when wounded or distracted. The injuries inflicted during both childhood and adult confrontations demonstrated that IT's physical forms, while resilient, weren't invulnerable. The creature could be cut, stabbed, shot, damaged in ways that caused genuine pain and forced retreat. Being made to feel small, terrified IT in ways the entity had rarely experienced. The adult losers discovered this weakness almost accidentally, their mockery and diminishment forcing IT to shrink physically as they asserted its insignificance. This vulnerability revealed profound truth about IT's psychology. The entity defined itself through victims' terror and awe. When confronted with contempt rather than fear, with laughter rather than screams, ET lost the psychological foundation that maintained its power. The cosmic horror became pathetic when treated as such, ancient evil reduced to cowardly predator, cornered by determined prey. Its psychological profile combined alien cognition with recognizable predatory instincts. The entity experienced something like pleasure in causing suffering, sadism that suggested emotional capacity, despite claims of being beyond human feeling. The creature clearly felt satisfaction from successful hunts, frustration when thwarted, rage when wounded. These emotional responses, while perhaps fundamentally different from human emotions, created recognizable patterns that allowed limited prediction of IT's behavior. The entity's arrogance grew from millennia of unchallenged success. It had survived since before human civilization, outlasted countless generations, adapted to every technological and cultural change. This track record bred confidence that bordered on contempt for its prey. The creature expected victory, couldn't imagine genuine defeat, struggled to adapt when opponents defied expectations. This psychological rigidity, combined with solitary nature that prevented learning through observation of peers, meant IT repeated strategies even when they failed, unable to conceive that humans might evolve effective countermeasures. Fear of being defeated or diminished represented IT's core vulnerability, ironic weakness in creature that fed on others' terror. The entity couldn't tolerate the possibility of its own destruction, the thought inducing something resembling panic. When genuinely threatened, IT retreated rather than risking complete destruction, suggesting preservation instinct that overrode hunger. This survival drive created exploitable opening, opponents who could inflict real damage, forcing IT into defensive posture where it became more vulnerable still. Confusion about courage remained its most significant blind spot. The entity understood fear intimately, had studied it across millennia, manipulated it with expert precision. Courage, however, remained fundamentally alien concept. It couldn't comprehend why someone would sacrifice themselves for another, couldn't understand friendship's power, couldn't predict behavior driven by love rather than self-preservation. This incomprehension left gaps in IT's defenses, moments where courageous action achieved results the entity hadn't anticipated or prepared against. It represented fear's purest distillation, ancient and alien yet dependent on human psychology, destroyer and parasite inextricably linked to its prey. The entity's cosmic origins and tremendous power couldn't overcome fundamental limitation. IT needed humans more than they needed it. Without conscious prey to provide terror and sustenance, the creature had no purpose, no function, no reason to exist. This dependency, masked by centuries of successful predation, meant that humans possessed ultimate power in the relationship, ability to resist, to fight back, to overcome ancient evil through means it couldn't fully understand or counter. The ritual of Chud represented humanity's attempt to codify confronting incomprehensible evil, translating instinctive courage into repeatable methodology. Ancient in origin, possibly predating recorded history, the ritual emerged from traditions spanning multiple cultures and continents. References appeared in Himalayan texts, indigenous American practices, and obscure European grimoires, suggesting either independent discovery of universal principles or transmission of knowledge across civilizations separated by geography and time. The ritual's core concept remained consistent despite cultural variations. Psychic battle of wills conducted at the boundary between mundane reality and cosmic dimensions. The mechanics involved creating connection between combatants that transcended physical proximity. Participants engaged through consciousness rather than bodies, minds meeting on plane where belief and willpower determined outcomes rather than physical strength. The metaphor commonly employed described opponents biting each other's tongues, locked in struggle, where first to release or laugh suffered defeat. This imagery, while symbolic, captured essential truth about the ritual's nature, intimate combat requiring absolute commitment and concentration. Indigenous peoples who confronted IT developed sophisticated understanding of the ritual's requirements. The Shokapiwa shamans, who faced the Galu, discovered that preparation involved more than simply deciding to fight. Successful participants required spiritual purification through fasting, meditation, and ceremonial practices that heightened consciousness while diminishing attachment to physical form. The ritual demanded entering altered state where boundaries between self and cosmos became permeable, dangerous condition that left practitioners vulnerable to complete psychic destruction if they lost the battle. The journey to the macroverse occurred during the ritual's deepest phases. Consciousness, freed from bodily constraints, travelled across dimensional barriers toward the realm where IT truly existed. This journey defied conventional spatial metaphors, the macroverse being not distant location, but different mode of existence underlying physical reality. Those who described the experience spoke of endless void, punctuated by lights, some warm and welcoming, others cold and hostile. The deadlights blazed brightest in this realm, their full horror visible without physical form's protective filters. Maturin the turtle inhabited the macroverse as IT's cosmic counterpart and eternal opposition. This entity, assuming form of enormous turtle whose shell contained galaxies, represented order, benevolence, and creative force. The relationship between Maturin and IT exemplified dualistic principles found throughout mythology and philosophy: light requiring darkness, creation needing destruction, good defining itself against evil. Neither could exist without the other. Cosmic balance depending on their continued opposition. Maturin's creation of the universe occurred accidentally, according to lore transmitted through esoteric traditions. The turtle experienced digestive distress, the resulting expulsion forming the known cosmos. This origin story, simultaneously absurd and profound, suggested that creation itself was unplanned, that existence emerged from bodily functions rather than deliberate design. The implication troubled those seeking meaning in cosmic order, though others found comfort in universe, born from natural processes rather than calculated intention. The turtle's philosophy emphasized self-reliance and internal strength. Maturin refused direct intervention in conflicts between IT and humanity, believing that genuine victory required participants to discover their own power. The advice the turtle offered to those who encountered it during psychic journeys followed consistent pattern, cryptic encouragement rather than explicit instruction. "You must help yourself" became signature phrase, frustrating counsel that contained profound wisdom. External rescue provided temporary relief, but left fundamental problems unresolved. True triumph required finding courage within. Bill Denborough's childhood encounter with Maturin during the 1958 confrontation provided limited but crucial guidance. Young Bill's consciousness, thrust toward the deadlights during his psychic engagement with IT, passed the turtle on its journey through the macroverse. Maturin offered cryptic advice about belief and willpower, suggesting that defeating IT required conviction more than technique. The turtle also introduced phrase that became Bill's mantra: "He thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts," tongue twister that helped Bill maintain concentration during the psychic battle. The relationship between the turtle and a higher power suggested hierarchies within cosmic structure. Some texts referenced Gan, also called the Other, supreme being from which both Maturin and IT allegedly derived. This entity, if it existed, remained distant from direct involvement in conflicts, perhaps observing from perspective, so removed that human struggles appeared insignificant. The theological implications troubled scholars of the esoteric, introducing questions about divine responsibility and cosmic justice that had no satisfying answers. Maturin's death between the 1958 and 1985 cycles shocked those who understood cosmic dynamics. The turtle, ancient beyond human comprehension, apparently choked on galaxies during bout of cosmic indigestion, dying in manner that mirrored its creative act. This death removed crucial ally from potential assistance during the adult losers' confrontation, leaving them without the guidance that had helped as children. It mocked this development, suggesting that even cosmic guardians were mortal, that nothing truly eternal existed to oppose it. The deadlights served as both destination and trap during the ritual of Tude. Consciousness approaching IT's true form risked being drawn into these lights, trapped in state between dimensions, where time and identity lost meaning. Those caught in the deadlights experienced total awareness of cosmic meaninglessness, human significance dissolving in face of infinite void. The madness resulting from this exposure wasn't psychological disorder, but accurate perception of reality humans weren't meant to comprehend. Rescue remained possible if someone could pull the victim back before complete absorption, though the rescued often retained psychological damage that never fully healed. Bill's mantra, taught by his father as stutter-breaking exercise, functioned as anchor during psychic combat. The phrase's rhythmic qualities and tongue-twisting complexity required concentration that prevented consciousness from drifting into the deadlight's pull. Repetition created mental focus that blocked Ait's attempts at psychological manipulation. The seemingly nonsensical phrase thus became weapon through pure utility, meaning less important than function. This demonstrated principle underlying the ritual of Chud. Tools mattered less than belief in their effectiveness. The adult confrontation with IT revealed Maturin's absence, but not complete abandonment. Though the turtle had died, its influence persisted through guidance already given and principles established. The loser's childhood victory had taught them essential truths. Courage multiplied through unity, belief translated into power, love overcoming fear. These lessons, even forgotten consciously, remained accessible subconsciously when circumstances required their application. Maturin's legacy endured through the wisdom it had imparted rather than ongoing intervention. Mike Hanlon's research during the decades between confrontations led him to Shokopiwa descendants who maintained fragments of traditional knowledge. These inheritors of indigenous wisdom shared information about the ritual of Chud that their ancestors had developed, ceremonial approaches to psychic combat refined through generations of experience. Mike learned that the ritual required tokens, physical objects connecting participants to their identities and purposes. These artifacts anchored consciousness during dimensional travel, preventing complete dissolution into the macroverse. The modified ritual Mike proposed for the 1985 confrontation attempted to combine indigenous methodology with the loser's childhood discoveries. The ceremonial vessel, allegedly used by the Shokopiwa in previous attempts, would trap IT's deadlights when combined with burning of meaningful tokens. The chanting, borrowed from native traditions, would create psychic resonance that weakened IT's defenses. Mike believed that their unique connection to IT, having wounded it previously, might allow success where indigenous peoples had failed despite their greater spiritual sophistication. The ritual's failure demonstrated limits of borrowed methodology. The ceremony proceeded as planned, the losers burning their childhood artifacts while chanting in unison, the deadlights appearing and being drawn into the vessel. For a brief moment, victory seemed assured. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, apparently sufficient for IT's destruction. The entity's laughter shattered that illusion, the deadlights exploding from containment, IT revealing that it had allowed the ritual to proceed merely to demonstrate its futility. Mike's confession that the indigenous peoples had been slaughtered when attempting the ritual added weight of deception to their crisis. He had withheld this information, believing that knowledge of previous failure would prevent his friends from returning. His calculation proved correct, but ethically troubling. Manipulation for perceived greater good that nonetheless violated trust. The revelation created moment of despair, the losers confronting ancient evil without the advantage they'd believed they possessed. The adaptation that followed demonstrated humanity's capacity for improvisation when formal methods failed. Rather than abandoning the ritual entirely, the losers modified it fundamentally, discarding borrowed ceremony in favor of principles they'd discovered as children. It could be hurt by courage, weakened by unity, diminished by refusal to accept its power as absolute. These truths learned through experience rather than tradition, proved more valuable than ancient knowledge accumulated by cultures that had ultimately failed against the entity. The psychic battle that occurred during their final confrontation resembled the ritual of Chud in essential aspects, despite abandoning ceremonial forms. Bill and Richie engaged IT on psychic level, their consciousness travelling partially into the macroverse during the struggle. The entity attempted to trap them in the deadlights, drawing them toward the lights that meant permanent loss. Richie's rescue of Bill from this trap required entering the same dimension, grabbing his friend's consciousness and pulling him back through force of will and love. The adult ritual succeeded through combination of physical and psychic assault. Eddie's attack with the fence post wounded IT's physical form, creating vulnerability that affected its psychic presence. The loser's mockery and diminishment attacked IT's psychological foundation, forcing the entity to shrink as their conviction in its smallness overwrote its sense of cosmic significance. This multi-front engagement, unplanned and improvised, proved more effective than any formal ceremony because it adapted to circumstances rather than following predetermined pattern. The question of whether the indigenous peoples could have succeeded using similar approach remained unanswered. Their cultural framework, interpreting IT as evil spirit rather than cosmic entity, shaped their ritual methodology differently. They sought to contain rather than destroy, to maintain balance rather than eliminate one side of cosmic dualism. This fundamental difference in objectives meant their ritual was designed for different purpose, making direct comparison difficult. The loser's willingness to risk cosmic imbalance through IT's complete destruction reflected either courage or foolishness, depending on perspective. The ritual of Chud ultimately demonstrated that defeating cosmic evil required not ancient formula, but timeless truth, courage, unity, and refusal to surrender despite terror. The ceremonial aspects, meaningful tokens, specific chants, even the psychic journey to the macroverse served primarily as focuses for will and belief. The actual power came from participants' conviction that they could win, their willingness to sacrifice for each other, their refusal to accept IT's dominance as inevitable. These qualities transcended cultural boundaries and temporal periods, available to any who could access them, despite overwhelming fear. Stephen King's novel, IT, published in 1986, established the foundation for cultural phenomenon that would span decades and multiple adaptations. The book arrived during King's most prolific period, when the author dominated horror publishing through combination of supernatural terror and psychological insight. It represented ambitious undertaking even by King's standards. The novel spanning over 100 pages in its original edition, employing dual timeline structure that alternated between the protagonist's childhood and adult experiences, demanding readers invest in complex narrative that refused simple linear progression. The novel's literary significance extended beyond commercial success to demonstrate horror fiction's capacity for serious themes. King used IT's supernatural elements as framework for exploring childhood trauma, memory's unreliability, friendship's power, and evil's banality. The Losers Club's experiences paralleled coming-of-age narratives while adding cosmic horror elements that elevated simple nostalgia into meditation on innocence, lost and courage maintained. Critics initially dismissed the work as commercial fiction, but subsequent analysis recognized its complexity and thematic depth. Certain elements of King's novel proved too controversial for mainstream adaptation. The notorious sewer scene, where the childhood losers cement their unity through inappropriate ritual, generated significant criticism even among the author's defenders. King himself later expressed uncertainty about the sequence's necessity, acknowledging that different approach might have achieved similar thematic goals. This controversy demonstrated that even successful horror could cross boundaries that made readers uncomfortable in ways beyond intended fear. The dual timeline structure, revolutionary for horror fiction, allowed King to explore how childhood experiences shaped adult identities. The parallel chapters created resonance between past and present, showing both continuity and change in the characters. Young Bill's determination to defeat IT found echo in adult Bill's professional success, but also in his continued guilt about Georgie. Beverly's childhood abuse directly influenced her adult relationship patterns. This structural innovation influenced subsequent horror and literary fiction, demonstrating that genre work could employ sophisticated narrative techniques. Tim Curry's portrayal in the 1990 television miniseries defined Pennywise for an entire generation, despite limited screen time. The actor appeared as the clown for approximately 8 minutes across the 4-hour broadcast, yet his performance achieved cultural ubiquity that exceeded the actual footage. Curry's interpretation emphasized theatrical menace, combining circus performers' exaggerated friendliness with Predator's calculating intelligence. His delivery of key phrases, particularly "we all float down here," entered popular culture permanently, quoted and referenced across subsequent decades. The miniseries faced significant limitations imposed by network television standards of the era. Violence occurred largely off-screen, or was suggested rather than shown. Its true spider form appeared only briefly, budget and technology constraining what could be convincingly portrayed. The psychological horror that worked effectively in print translated imperfectly to visual medium designed for family viewing. Despite these constraints, the miniseries succeeded in terrifying audiences, particularly children who encountered it during original broadcast or subsequent cable reruns. The production's impact on coulrophobia, fear of clowns, cannot be overstated. While clown anxiety existed previously, the 1990 miniseries intensified and spread this phobia across demographic groups. Children who watched Pennywise, whether with parental permission or through clandestine viewing, developed lasting associations between clowns and danger. The entertainment industry noted this shift, clowns transitioning from wholesome children's entertainers to cultural symbols of threat. Birthday party clowns reported decreased bookings, circuses faced attendance declines, and the profession underwent transformation that reflected IT's cultural penetration. The 2017 film adaptation, directed by Andy Muschietti, brought substantially increased budget and contemporary filmmaking techniques to the material. Bill Skarsgård's interpretation of Pennywise diverged significantly from Curry's theatrical approach, emphasizing otherworldly wrongness over recognizable menace. Skarsgård's physical performance included unsettling movements, misaligned features, and vocal distortions that suggested entity wearing human form rather than human playing role. This approach aligned more closely with IT's cosmic horror origins, while remaining accessible to mainstream audiences. The decision to split the narrative into 2 films, separating childhood and adult timelines rather than interweaving them, provided extended development time for both periods. Chapter 1 focused exclusively on the 1980s childhood encounters, updated from the novel's 1950s setting to reflect contemporary nostalgia cycles. The film achieved remarkable commercial success, becoming highest-grossing horror film at the time of release, demonstrating audience appetite for sophisticated horror that balanced terror with emotional resonance. It Chapter 2, released in 2019, tackled the adult timeline with mixed results. The film struggled with pacing and tonal consistency that hadn't troubled the first installment. The adult actors sometimes unable to generate chemistry their younger counterparts had achieved. However, the adaptation made significant modifications to the novel's resolution, emphasizing belief and emotional connection over the book's more controversial approaches to defeating IT. These changes reflected contemporary sensibilities, while maintaining essential themes about courage and friendship. The film's updated timeline, shifting the childhood period to 1989 and adult return to 2016, reflected strategic decision about audience nostalgia. The 1980s occupied position in contemporary culture, similar to what the 1950s represented when King wrote the novel, periods simultaneously idolized and recognized as containing darkness beneath surface normalcy. This translation maintained the story's thematic concerns about memory and childhood while making temporal setting relevant to modern viewers. E.T. Welcome to Derry, the prequel series announced for 2025, represented ambitious expansion of the narrative universe. The show planned to explore Derry's history across multiple cycles of IT's awakening, focusing particularly on the 1962 cycle that preceded the Losers Club's encounters. The series' format allowed deeper examination of supporting characters, historical tragedies, and the town's complicity in enabling IT's predations. Plans for 3 seasons, each exploring different era, suggested long-term commitment to developing the mythology beyond what films could accomplish. The prequels focus on the 1960s cycle, particularly the events surrounding the Black Spot Fire and other period tragedies, enabled exploration of social issues that the films touched only briefly. Racial violence, Cold War anxiety, and cultural transformation of the era provided rich context for horror that worked through both supernatural and human evil. The series' approach suggested maturation of franchise beyond simple monster scares toward comprehensive examination of how communities enable and respond to persistent threats. The cultural impact of coulrophobia intensification following IT's various adaptations extended into professional consequences for working clowns. Birthday entertainers, circus performers, and other clown professionals reported significant business declines following both the miniseries and films. Some left the profession entirely, unable to overcome public association between their craft and Pennywise. Others adapted by emphasizing non-threatening aspects of clown performance or transitioning to different entertainment styles. The phenomenon demonstrated how fictional representations could materially affect real-world professions. Psychological research into coulrophobia increased following IT's cultural prominence. Studies examined why clowns triggered anxiety in substantial portions of the population, identifying factors including facial paint obscuring natural expressions, exaggerated features creating uncanny valley effects, and cultural associations with deception and threat. It both reflected and amplified these pre-existing anxieties, giving concrete form to inchoate discomfort many felt about clowns even before encountering Pennywise. King's interconnected universe, within which IT occupied significant position, revealed itself through various connections to other works. Dick Halloran's appearance as Black Spot survivor directly linked IT to The Shining, the character's psychic abilities functioning similarly in both narratives. This connection suggested that sensitivity to supernatural phenomena existed across King's fictional universe, certain individuals naturally perceiving threats that others couldn't acknowledge. Halloran's survival of both the Black Spot Fire and the Overlook Hotel's horrors positioned him as a recurring figure capable of confronting evil across different manifestations. References to IT appeared throughout King's bibliography. The Tommyknockers mentioned Derry and its peculiar history, characters discussing the town's reputation for tragedy. The novel, 11/22/63, featured Derry prominently, protagonist Jake Epping visiting the town during the late 1950s and witnessing the aftermath of IT's activities. Dreamcatcher returned to Derry area, exploring different supernatural threats while acknowledging the town's dark past. These connections created sense of cohesive universe where supernatural evil manifested in various forms across time and geography. The Dark Tower series, King's magnum opus connecting multiple universes and dimensions, incorporated elements from IT's mythology. Maturin the Turtle appeared in Dark Tower lore as one of the Beam Guardians, cosmic entities maintaining reality's structure. Gan, mentioned briefly in IT as Power Above Maturin, received expanded treatment as the ultimate creator force in the Tower cosmology. These connections elevated IT from isolated horror story to component of King's grand metaphysical framework. Thematic significance of IT's enduring appeal centered on universal experiences that transcended specific horror elements. Childhood trauma, whether from supernatural sources or ordinary abuse and neglect, resonated with readers and viewers who recognized authentic emotional truth beneath fantastic surface. The story acknowledged that children faced real dangers, that adults often failed to protect them, that sometimes young people needed to save themselves when those responsible for their safety proved inadequate or complicit. Memory and forgetting, central to IT's narrative structure, explored how trauma shaped identity while remaining partially inaccessible to conscious recall. The loser's amnesia regarding their childhood confrontation reflected genuine psychological phenomena, where traumatic experiences became suppressed, yet continued influencing behavior and emotion. The story suggested that buried experiences retained power, that forgotten truths could be recovered when circumstances demanded, that past battles informed present courage even when specific memories disappeared. The power of belief, demonstrated repeatedly throughout IT's narrative, offered optimistic counterweight to cosmic horror's usual nihilism. Where Lovecraftian horror typically portrayed humanity as insignificant before indifferent universe, IT suggested that human conviction could literally reshape reality, that courage possessed tangible power, that evil could be defeated through unified will. This theme resonated with audiences seeking horror that acknowledged darkness while affirming human agency and potential for heroism. Friendship as weapon against isolation and fear provided emotional core that distinguished IT from simpler monster stories. The Losers Club's bond, forged through shared danger and mutual support, generated power that IT's solitary nature couldn't comprehend or counter. This emphasis on connection over individual heroism reflected evolved understanding of courage, acknowledging that bravery often required community support, that vulnerability and interdependence represented strength rather than weakness. The confrontation between childhood courage and adult cynicism explored how aging affected capacity for wonder and belief. Children in IT's narrative possessed imaginative flexibility that made them both vulnerable to IT's shape-shifting and capable of believing in weapons that worked through conviction rather than physical properties. Adults, burdened by rationality and life experience, struggled to access similar belief, their sophisticated worldviews becoming liabilities when facing evil that operated outside rational frameworks. The story suggested that maintaining childlike capacity for wonder and belief represented form of wisdom rather than mere nostalgia. Its enduring power derived not from creatures' horror alone, but from recognition of universal human experiences, childhood fear, forgotten trauma, courage found in friendship, and the difficult work of confronting past pain to prevent its continuation into future generations. The story's various adaptations succeeded or failed based on their ability to maintain this thematic depth while delivering effective scares, suggesting that audiences sought substantive horror that engaged both emotions and intellect rather than simple shock value. The cycle continues, not in Derry perhaps, but in every heart that knows fear, every child who faces darkness, every friend who stands beside another in terror's presence. Its story transcends specific entity and particular town to illuminate universal truths about human nature and evil's persistent manifestations. The pattern of awakening, feeding, hibernation that marked Derry's centuries reflects larger cycles that operate throughout human experience, periods of danger followed by false security, trauma suppressed until circumstances force its acknowledgement, courage discovered only when necessity demands its expression. Fear as universal constant connects all who encounter its narrative, whether through direct fictional engagement or metaphorical recognition of similar threats in ordinary life. The entity's ability to manifest as personalized nightmares demonstrates that terror operates most effectively through intimate knowledge of individual vulnerabilities. Each person carries private fears that seem trivial to others, yet feel overwhelming when confronted alone. Its shape-shifting thus becomes metaphor for how evil adapts to exploit specific weaknesses, requiring equally personalized courage to overcome. Forgetting emerges as both mercy and curse throughout the narrative. The loser's amnesia protects them from constant awareness of cosmic horror, while leaving them vulnerable to repeated predation. This duality reflects actual psychological processes where trauma becomes suppressed to enable continued functioning, yet remains active beneath consciousness, influencing behavior and emotion. Memory's fragility and importance interweave throughout human experience, the challenge being to remember what's necessary for growth without being paralyzed by past pain. Courage reveals itself not as fearlessness, but as action despite terror. The losers succeed not because they feel no fear, but because they refuse to let fear dictate their choices. This distinction matters profoundly, suggesting that heroism remains accessible to anyone, regardless of temperament or circumstance. Bravery becomes choice rather than inherent quality, decision to move forward despite overwhelming desire to retreat. This democratization of courage offers hope that ordinary people can confront extraordinary evil when circumstances demand. Friendship's power against isolation demonstrates that connection provides literal defense against threats that target vulnerable individuals. E.T. struggles against unified resistance, the entity's solitary nature, unable to comprehend or counter bonds forged through mutual support and shared danger. This pattern extends beyond supernatural context to everyday life, where community and solidarity provide protection against forces that overwhelm isolated persons. The Losers Club's victory validates investment in relationships that create networks of mutual protection and encouragement. Childhood innocence versus adult knowledge creates tension throughout the narrative. Children possess imaginative flexibility and capacity for belief that adults have rationalized away, yet children also lack experience and resources that adults command. The most effective resistance combines childlike wonder with adult determination, maintaining openness to possibilities while applying strategic thinking. This balance suggests that maturity need not require abandoning all aspects of youth, that wisdom involves selective retention of childhood qualities alongside accumulated experience. Belief's tangible effects demonstrate that conviction shapes reality more than typically acknowledged. Throughout IT's story, outcomes depend less on objective power than on participants' certainty about what's possible. Silver slugs and fence posts become weapons through collective faith in their effectiveness. IT shrinks when treated with contempt rather than fear. These examples suggest that psychological and social realities possess weight equal to physical facts, that shared conviction can literally reshape what exists. Evil's ancient persistence, balanced against humanity's recurring victory, provides cautiously optimistic framework. It survived millennia, adapted to countless changes, overcame most resistance, yet children armed with improvised weapons and pure determination achieved what seemed impossible. This pattern repeats across human history, overwhelming threats defeated by unlikely heroes, ancient evils overcome through courage that emerges when most needed. The cycle continues because both evil and resistance to evil remain constants in human experience. Small acts of bravery accumulate into larger triumphs. No single moment defeated IT, but rather sustained resistance across multiple encounters. Eddie's wound, Beverly's shot, Bill's determination, each contribution mattered within collective effort. This distribution of heroism across ordinary actions suggests that confronting evil rarely requires superhuman feats, but rather persistent ordinary courage, multiplied through community support. Ordinary people become heroes through circumstances rather than destiny. The losers weren't chosen by prophecy or marked by special abilities beyond their capacity for friendship and refusal to surrender. Their ordinariness made their victory more remarkable and more replicable, demonstrating that heroism remains available to anyone when necessity calls. Stories preserve truth when memory fails. The various tellings of IT's story, through novel, adaptations, and continued cultural presence, maintain awareness of patterns that individuals forget. Cultural memory functions where personal recollection fails, preserving warnings and examples that benefit those who never directly experienced the original events. This transmission of knowledge through narrative represents humanity's primary defense against cyclical threats, each generation learning from previous struggles. If stories survive to inform them, hope persists despite horror, because resistance succeeds often enough to justify continued effort. Its defeat wasn't certain. Many struggled against the entity and failed, yet the possibility of victory remained real. This uncertainty, this genuine risk that evil might triumph, makes the loser's success meaningful. Hope becomes earned rather than assumed, validated through actual achievement rather than wishful thinking. Sleep's mercy arrives after confronting darkness, rest earned through vigilance and struggle. The journey through IT's history, from cosmic origins to final destruction, traces pattern of danger recognized, confronted, and overcome. Understanding doesn't eliminate fear, but provides framework for managing it. Knowledge that evil can be defeated by ordinary people acting extraordinarily when circumstances demand. And so our journey through time concludes where it began, with an ancient evil beneath a small town, held at bay not by ritual or weapon, but by ordinary people choosing courage over fear, together over alone, remembering over forgetting. The creature may have been destroyed, but the truth it revealed remains, that we all float, suspended between terror and triumph, and only by grasping each other's hands do we find solid ground. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled not with clowns in sewers, but with paper boats sailing safely, red balloons lifting towards sunlight, and the gentle knowledge that together we need never float alone.